Death in the Clouds by Agatha Christie. Read by Bo McKenna. The September sun beat down hotly on Le Bourget aerodrome as the passengers crossed the ground and climbed into the airliner Prometheus, due to depart for Croydon in a few minutes' time. Jane Grey was among the last to enter and take her seat, number 16. Some of the passengers had already passed on through the centre door, past the tiny pantry kitchen and the 2 toilets, to the front car. On the opposite side of the gangway there was a good deal of chatter, a rather shrill, high-pitched woman's voice dominating it. Jane's lips twisted slightly. She knew that particular type of voice so well. "My dear, it's extraordinary. Where do you say? Juan-les-Pins? Oh, Lepine. But of course, let's sit together. Oh, can't we? Oh, I see." And then a man's voice, foreign, polite. "With the greatest of pleasure, madame." A little elderly man, with large moustaches and an egg-shaped head, was politely moving himself and his belongings from the seat corresponding to Jane's on the opposite side of the gangway. Jane turned her head slightly and got a view of the 2 women. The mention of Lepine had stimulated her curiosity, for Jane had also been at Lepine. She remembered one of the women perfectly. She had seen her last at the baccarat table, her delicately made-up Dresden china face flushing and paling alternately. A friend had mentioned that she was a peeress, but not one of the proper ones, only a chorus girl. The other woman was the real thing, the horsey county type, thought Jane, and forthwith forgot the 2 women and interested herself in the view through the window of the aerodrome. The one place she was obstinately determined not to look was straight in front of her, where, on the seat opposite, sat a young man. If she did, she might catch his eye, and that would never do. Mechanics shouted in French, the engine roared, relaxed, roared again, obstructions were pulled away, the plane started. Jane caught her breath. It was only her 2nd flight. She was still capable of being thrilled. They were off the ground, rising, sweeping round. There was Le Bourget beneath them. The midday service to Croydon contained 21 passengers, 10 in the forward compartment, 11 in the rear one. It had 2 pilots and 2 stewards. As the plane roared above France on its way to the Channel, the passengers in the rear compartment thought their various thoughts. Jane Grey thought, "I won't look at him. I won't." Resolutely she switched her mind back to what she called the beginning. That purchase of a ticket in the Irish sweep. There'd been a lot of laughter and teasing chatter in the hairdressing establishment in which Jane and 5 other young ladies were employed. Well, she hadn't won it being the big prize, but she had won £100. £100. So many of her ladies had been going to Lepine, or just come back from Lepine, Jane had thought to herself, why the devil can't I go to Lepine? Well, now she could. Was it possible that now 10 days at Lepine had dwindled down to 1 incident? An incident at the roulette table? Contrary to the prevalent superstition, Jane's beginner's luck had been bad. She had won a little, but had lost more. This was her 4th evening, and the last stake of that evening. There were 2 numbers on which nobody had staked, 5 and 6. Which of them? 5 or 6? Which did she feel? 5. 5 was going to turn up. The ball was spun. 6. She'd put it on 6. Just in time. She and another player opposite staked simultaneously, she on 6, he on 5. "Rien ne va plus," said the croupier. The ball clicked. Settled. "Le numéro 5, rouge, impair, manque." Jane could have cried out with vexation. The croupier swept away the stakes and paid out. The man opposite said, "Aren't you going to take up your winnings?" "Mine? But I put on 6. "Indeed you didn't. I put on 6, and you put on 5. He smiled, a very attractive smile. White teeth in a very brown face, blue eyes, crisp short hair. Half unbelievingly Jane picked up her gains. Perhaps she had put her counters on 5. She looked doubtingly at the stranger, and he smiled easily back. "That's right," he said. And with a friendly little nod he had moved away. That, too, had been nice of him. She might have suspected otherwise that he had let her take his winnings in order to scrape acquaintance with her. But he wasn't that kind of man. He was nice. And here he was, sitting opposite to her. Jane looked across the gangway. The two women had stopped talking. The Dresden China woman exclaimed petulantly, examining a broken fingernail. She rang the bell, and when the white-coated steward appeared, she said, "Send my maid to me. She's in the other compartment." "Yes, my lady," said the steward, very deferential. A dark-haired French girl dressed in black appeared. She carried a small jewel case. Lady Horbury spoke to her in French. "Adeline, I want my red Morocco case." The maid passed along the gangway. At the extreme end of the car were some piled-up rugs and cases. The girl returned with a small red dressing case. Cicely Horbury took it and dismissed the maid. "That's all right, Madeline. I'll keep it here." The maid went out again. Lady Horbury opened the case and extracted a nail file. Then she looked at her face in a small mirror and touched it up here and there. A little powder, more lipstick. Jane's lips curled scornfully. Her glance travelled farther down the car. Behind the two women was the little foreigner who had yielded his seat to the county woman. Heavily wrapped up in unnecessary mufflers, he appeared to be fast asleep. Perhaps made uneasy by Jane's scrutiny, his eyes opened and looked at her for a moment, then closed again. Beside him sat a tall, grey-haired man with an authoritative face. He had a flute case open in front of him and was polishing the flute with loving care. Funny, thought Jane. He didn't look like a musician, more like a lawyer or a doctor. Behind those were a couple of Frenchmen, one with a beard and one much younger, perhaps his son. They were talking and gesticulating in an excited manner. Sitting opposite Jane, Norman Gale was thinking, "She is pretty, really pretty. She remembers me all right." She looked so disappointed when her stakes were swept away. It was worth a lot more than that to see her pleasure when she won. I did that rather well. The Countess of Horbury thought, "My God, what shall I do? It's the hell of a mess. There's only one way out. If only I had the nerve. Why did I ever take to coke? That cat Venetia Carr being here makes it worse. Wanted Stephen herself, but she didn't get him. My God, what shall I do?" The Honourable Venetia Carr thought, "Bloody little tart, that's what she is. Poor old Stephen, if he could only get rid of her." Monsieur Hercule Poirot thought, "She is pretty, that little one over there. Why is she so determined not to look at the handsome young man opposite her?" The plane dropped slightly. "Mon estomac," thought Hercule Poirot, and closed his eyes determinedly. Beside him, Dr. Bryant, caressing his flute with nervous hands, thought, "This is the turning point of my career." Monsieur Dupont-Père turned excitedly in his seat and shouted at Monsieur Dupont-Fils, sitting beside him. "There is no doubt about it. They are all wrong. The Germans, the Americans, the English, the date, the prehistoric buttery, all wrong." Jean Dupont, tall, fair, with a false air of indolence, said, "You must take the evidence from all sources." Armand Dupont wrenched open a battered attaché case. "Take these Kurdish pipes such as they make today. The decoration on them is almost exactly similar to that on the pottery of 5000 BC. An eloquent gesture almost swept away the plate that a steward was placing in front of him. Mr. Clancy, writer of detective stories, rose from his seat behind Norman Gale and padded to the end of the car, extracted a Continental Bradshaw from his raincoat pocket, and returned with it to work out a complicated alibi for professional purposes. Mr. Ryder, in the seat behind him, thought, "I'll have to keep my end up, but it's not going to be easy. I don't see how I'm going to raise the funds for the next dividend. Oh, hell." Norman Gale rose and went to the toilet. As soon as he had gone, Jane drew out a mirror and surveyed her face anxiously. She also applied powder and lipstick. A steward placed coffee in front of her. A wasp buzzed around Mr. Clancy's head just as he was dealing with 1955 at Sallyplot, and he struck at it absently. The wasp flew off to investigate the Dupons' coffee cups. Jean Dupont slew it neatly. Peace settled on the car. Right at the end of the car, in seat number 2, Madame Giselle's head lolled forward a little. One might have taken her to be asleep, but she was not asleep. She neither spoke nor thought. Madame Giselle was dead. Henry Mitchell, senior of the 2 stewards, passed swiftly from table to table, depositing bills. 2 of the passengers were asleep, the little man with the moustaches and the old woman down at the end. She was a good tipper. He remembered her crossing several times. About 5 minutes before they reached Croydon, he stood by her side. "Pardon, madam, your bill." He laid a deferential hand on her shoulder. She did not wake. Mitchell bent over her, then straightened up with a white face. He walked swiftly back to the front car. Albert Davis, second steward, said, "You sure, Henry?" Henry Mitchell was white and shaking. They arranged their course of action. Mitchell returned to the rear car. He went from table to table, bending his head and murmuring confidentially, "Excuse me, sir, you don't happen to be a doctor?" Norman Gale said, "I'm a dentist. If there's anything—" He half rose from his seat. "I'm a doctor," said Bryant. "What's the matter?" "There's a lady at the end there." Dr. Bryant bent over the huddled figure in seat number 2, the figure of a stoutish, middle-aged woman dressed in heavy black. His examination was brief. "She's dead," he said. "She's been dead at least half an hour." Heads were craning round to look. A voice at Dr. Bryant's elbow, the voice of the muffled-up man with the moustaches. "There is," he said, "a mark on her neck." "True," said Dr. Bryant. The woman's head lolled sideways. There was a minute puncture mark on the side of her throat. "Pardon?" The 2 Dupons joined in. It was Jean, the younger Dupont, who spoke. "There was a wasp flying about. I killed it." He exhibited the corpse in his coffee saucer. "Is it not possible that the poor lady has died of a wasp sting?" "It is a possible explanation," said Dr. Bryant. "The, body must not be moved, steward." "Yes, sir, I quite understand." Dr. Bryant prepared to resume his seat and looked in some surprise at the small, muffled-up foreigner who was standing his ground. "Pardon," said the little man. "There is something that has been overlooked." The steward and Dr. Bryant caught the glint of yellow and black on the floor, half concealed by the edge of the black skirt. Hercule Poirot went down on his knees. He took a small pair of tweezers from his pocket and stood up with his prize. "It is very like a wasp, but it is not a wasp." A little knot of teased, fluffy silk, orange and black, attached to a long, peculiar-looking thorn with a discoloured tip, was clearly displayed. "Good gracious me!" The exclamation came from little Mr. Clancy. He swelled with passionate pride. "This object, gentlemen, is the native thorn shot from a blowpipe, and I strongly suspect that on the tip is the famous arrow poison of the South American Indians. finished Hercule Poirot, and he added, "Est-ce que c'est possible?" "I am myself a writer of detective fiction, but actually to meet in real life—" Words failed Mr. Clancy. The plane circled round in its descent to Croydon Aerodrome. The rather absurd-looking little man in the mufflers whispered to Mitchell, and the steward nodded. The plane was running along the ground now. When it finally came to a stop, Mitchell raised his voice. I must ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to remain in your seats until somebody in authority takes charge." "Nonsense!" cried Lady Horbury angrily. "Don't you know who I am?" "Very sorry, milady. Can't make exceptions." The wait was not a long one before an erect, soldierly figure in plain clothes, accompanied by a uniformed policeman, came hurriedly across the aerodrome and climbed into the plane. The newcomer listened to Mitchell and Dr. Bryant, flung a quick glance over the crumpled figure of the dead woman, and gave an order to the constable. Then he escorted the passengers out of the plane and across the aerodrome to a small, private room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you will remain here, I hope not to keep you waiting any longer than is unavoidable. I want a few words with Dr. Bryant, my name is. Thank you. Come this way with me, Doctor." "May I assist at your interview?" It was the little man with the moustaches. The inspector turned on him, a sharp retort on his lips. Then his face changed suddenly. "Sorry, Monsieur Poirot," he said. "You're so muffled up I didn't recognize you. Come along by all means." Inspector Japp held the door open, and Bryant and Poirot passed through, followed by the suspicious glance of the rest of the passengers. "You've got a knack of turning up in the most unexpected places, Monsieur Poirot." "Isn't Croydon Aerodrome a little out of your beat, my friend?" asked Poirot. "Ah, I'm after a big bug in the smuggling line. Bit of luck, my being on the spot. Now then, Doctor, perhaps you'll give me your full name and address." "Roger James Bryant. I am a specialist on diseases of the ear and throat. My address is 329 Harley Street. "Can you give us any idea of the time of death, Doctor?" asked Japp. "The woman must have been dead at least half an hour when I examined her." "I suppose it's no good asking you if you observed anything of a suspicious nature?" asked the inspector. The doctor shook his head. "And me, I was asleep," said Poirot with deep chagrin. "I suffer almost as badly in the air as on the sea." Japp indicated the discoloured thorn which was lying in a small box on the table in front of him. "Do you have any idea, Doctor, what would be likely to be on this?" Dr. Bryant shook his head. "Curare is the usual poison employed by the natives, I believe, and it is a very swift and rapid poison." "But not very easy to obtain, eh?" queried Japp. "Not at all easy, for a layman." The doctor left the room, and Japp tooted back his chair and looked at Poirot. "Blowpipes and poison darts in an aeroplane," he said. "It insults one's intelligence." "That, my friend, is a very profound remark," said Poirot. Japp strode to the door and gave an order. The two stewards were ushered in. The younger had recovered his balance. The other steward still looked white and frightened. "Sit down, my lads," said Japp. "Got the passports?" "Good." He sorted through them quickly. "Ah, here we are. Marie Morisot. French passport. Know anything about her?" "I've seen her before. She crossed to and fro from England fairly often," said Mitchell. "Ah, in business of some kind?" The younger steward said, "I remember her too. I saw her on the early service, the 8 o'clock from Paris." "Which of you was the last to see her alive?" "I was," said Mitchell. "I took her a coffee, handed her the sugar and offered her milk, which she refused." "And when did you see her next?" "When I took the bills round, about a quarter of an hour later. I thought she was asleep." "You didn't see any sign of this?" Japp indicated the little wasp-like dart. "No, sir, I didn't." What about you, Davis? Japp inquired. The last time I saw her was when I was handing the biscuits to go with the cheese. She was all right then. There's nothing you can think of that throws any light on this business, either of you? Both men thought, then shook their heads. Japp made a gesture of dismissal. Poirot leaned forward. Permit me one little question. Go ahead, Monsieur Poirot. Did either of you notice a wasp flying about the plane? Both men shook their heads, then left the room. Japp was running his eye rapidly over the passports. Better see the Countess first, before she goes right off the handle. You will, I suppose, search very carefully all the baggage, the hand baggage, of the passengers in the rear car of the plane? Said Poirot. Japp looked at him curiously. I don't quite see what you're driving at, Monsieur Poirot. We know what we're looking for. You may, mon ami, but I am not so sure. Lady Horbury answered Japp's questions without the least hesitation. She described herself as the wife of the Earl of Horbury, gave her address as Horbury Chase, Sussex, and 315 Grosvenor Square, London. She was returning to London from Lupine and Paris. The deceased woman was quite unknown to her. She had noticed nothing suspicious during the flight. In any case, she had been facing the other way. She had not left her seat during the journey. As far as she remembered, no one entered the rear car from the front one, with the exception of the stewards. She thought that 2 of the men passengers had left the rear car to go to the toilets, but she was not sure of this. She had not observed anyone handling a blowpipe. No, in answer to Poirot, she had not noticed a wasp in the car. Lady Horbury was succeeded by the Honourable Venetia Carr. She gave her address as Little Paddocks, Horbury, Sussex. Miss Carr's evidence was much the same as that of her friend. She had never seen the deceased before. She had noticed nothing suspicious. Yes, she had seen some of the passengers farther down the car striking at a wasp. One of them she thought had killed it. That was after luncheon had been served. Exit Miss Carr. You seem very much interested in that wasp, Monsieur Poirot, said Japp. The wasp is not so much interesting as suggestive. Eh? Said Poirot. Japp changed the subject. Those 2 Frenchmen are the ones in this. They were just across the gangway from the Morisot woman, and that battered suitcase of theirs is fairly plastered with outlandish foreign labels. Shouldn't be surprised if they'd been to Borneo or South America. We'll have to get the Sûreté to collaborate over this, but if you ask me, those 2 toughs are our mate. Poirot's eyes twinkled. As regards some of your points, you are in error, my friend. Those 2 men are not toughs. They are, on the contrary, 2 very distinguished and learned archaeologists. Monsieur Armand Dupont and his son Jean Dupont. They have returned not long ago from conducting some very interesting excavations in Persia, at a site not far from Susa. You must admit, they don't look much, said Japp. The world's famous men seldom do. I, myself, moi qui vous parle, I have before now been taken for a hairdresser. You don't say, said Japp with a grin. Well, let's have our distinguished archaeologists. Monsieur Dupont-Père declared that the deceased was quite unknown to him. He had noticed nothing. He had been discussing prehistoric pottery of the Near East with his son. He had not left his seat at all. Yes, he had noticed a wasp towards the end of lunch. His son had killed it. Monsieur Jean confirmed this evidence. Mr. Clancy, who was next, came in for rather a bad time. Inspector Japp asked him if he had ever owned a blowpipe. Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I have. Indeed? Inspector Japp pounced on the statement. Little Mr. Clancy fairly squeaked with agitation. You must not misunderstand. I can explain. I bought one in the Charing Cross Road at least 2 years ago now, and an artist friend of mine very kindly drew it, with the fingerprints the position of them on the blowpipe, to illustrate a point in my book, the clue of the scarlet petal." "Did you keep the blowpipe?" "Why, yes, I think so. I mean, yes, I did. It must be somewhere about. I can't say where. I am not a very tidy man." Inspector Japp bent a glance of cold suspicion on him and continued his questions. "Did you leave your seat at all in the plane?" "No, certainly not. At least, well, yes, I went to get a Continental Bradshaw out of my raincoat pocket by the entrance at the end." "So, you passed close by the deceased seat?" "No, at least, well, yes, I must have done." Further questions drew negative answers. Poirot intervened with a question about wasps. Yes, Mr. Clancy had noticed a wasp. He struck at it, and it went away. This was just after the steward had brought him his coffee. Mr. Clancy was allowed to depart, which he did with relief on his face. "Looks a bit fishy to me," said Japp. "He actually owns a blowpipe. Now let's have Norman Gale." Norman Gale gave his address as 14 Shepherd's Avenue, Muswell Hill. By profession, he was a dentist. He was returning from a holiday spent at Lupine on the French coast. He had spent a day in Paris looking at various new types of dental instruments. He had never seen the deceased and had noticed nothing suspicious. He had left his seat once during the journey to go to the toilet. He had returned to his seat and had never been near the rear end of the car. He had not noticed any wasp. After him came James Ryder, somewhat on edge and brusque in manner. He was returning from a business visit to Paris. He did not know the deceased. Yes, he had occupied the seat immediately in front of hers. No one had come down the car except the stewards. Yes, the 2 Frenchmen had occupied the seats across the gangway from him. The younger of the 2 had killed a wasp at the conclusion of the meal. No, he hadn't noticed the wasp previously. He didn't know what a blowpipe was like, as he'd never seen one. There was a tap at the door. A police constable entered, subdued triumph in his bearing. He laid his prize on the table. The object displayed was a blowpipe of native manufacture. Japp drew his breath in sharply. Mr. Ryder leant forward interestedly. "Where was it found?" asked Japp sharply. "Pushed down behind seat number 9, sir." "Very entertaining," said Poirot. "Number 9 was my seat." "Well, that looks a bit odd for you, I must say," said Mr. Ryder. Japp frowned. "Thank you, Mr. Ryder. That will do." When Ryder had gone, he turned to Poirot with a grin. "This your work, old bird?" "Mon ami," said Poirot with dignity. "When I commit a murder, it will not be with the owl poison of the South American Indians." "Who have we got left?" said Japp. "Only one girl, Jane Grey. Sounds like a history book." "A pretty girl. And nervous," said Poirot. "Nervous, eh?" said Japp alertly. "Oh, my dear friend, when a girl is nervous, it usually means a young man, not a murder." Jane answered the questions put to her clearly enough. She was employed at Monsieur Antoine's hairdressing establishment in Bruton Street. Her home address was 10 Harrogate Street, NW5. She was returning to England from Lupine. Further questions drew the story of the sweep ticket. Shown the blowpipe, Jane denied having seen it at any time. She did not know the deceased. Nothing else of any value was elicited from her, and she was allowed to go. Japp fell back into contemplation of the blowpipe. "It beats me," he said. "What have we got to look for now?" "If you observe closely, my friend," said Poirot, "you will notice a microscopic piece of paper adhering to the pipe. It looks to me very much like the remains of a torn-off price ticket. I fancy that this particular specimen has journeyed from the wilds via some curio dealer's shop." The inquest on Marie Morisot was held 4 days later. The sensational manner of her death had aroused great public interest, and the coroner's court was crowded. The first witness called was a tall, elderly Frenchman with a grey beard, Maître Alexandre Thibault. The coroner asked, "Did you recognize the body of the deceased?" "Yes. It is that of my client, Marie-Angélique Morisot. I am her solicitor." "Was she known to the public by another name?" "Yes. Madame Giselle," said the Frenchman. A stir of excitement went round. Reporters sat with pencils poised. The coroner said, "Will you tell us exactly who this Madame Morisot, or Madame Giselle, was?" "Madame Giselle, to give her her professional name, the name under which she did business, was one of the best money-lenders in Paris." "I understand that she journeyed to England fairly frequently," said the coroner. "Yes. Many of her clients were English people. Her clientele were mostly among the upper and professional classes, in cases where it was important that the utmost discretion should be observed." "May I ask," said the coroner, "if you have an intimate knowledge of her, various business transactions?" "No. I dealt with a legal business, but Madame Giselle was a first-class woman of business." "And was she a rich woman at the time of her death?" asked the coroner. "She was an extremely wealthy woman." Maître Thibault stepped down, and Henry Mitchell was called. The coroner said, "On Tuesday last, the 18th, you were on duty in your employment as senior steward on the Prometheus on the 12 o'clock service from Paris to Croydon. Had you ever seen the deceased before?" "Yes, sir. I was on the 8:45 a.m. service 6 months ago, and I noticed her travelling by that once or twice." "Have you ever heard the name of Madame Giselle?" "No, sir." The blowpipe was handed to him. Mitchell took it gingerly. "You did not see that in the hands of any of the passengers?" "No, sir." The coroner called Dr. Roger Bryant and asked him to explain in his own words what had happened. "Just before getting into Croydon," said Dr. Bryant, "I was approached by the chief steward. He asked me if I was a doctor. He told me one of the passengers had been taken ill. The woman in question had in fact been dead between half an hour and an hour." "Did you form any theory as to the cause of death?" "No." "But you noticed a small puncture on the side of the neck?" "Yes," said Dr. Bryant. Dr. James Whistler, police surgeon, was called to give his evidence. "I noticed a circular puncture on the side of the neck of the deceased. This mark was quite consistent with having been caused by the sting of a wasp, or by the insertion of a thorn. I came to the conclusion that death was caused by the introduction of a powerful toxin into the bloodstream." Mr. Henry Winterspoon was then called. He was an expert on rare poisons. "I should say that originally the dart had been dipped in a preparation of native curare, an arrow poison used by certain tribes." The reporters wrote with gusto. "But, according to my analysis, the dart had recently been dipped in the venom of Dyspholidus tipus, better known as the boomslang or tree snake." "Boomslang? What is a boomslang?" demanded the coroner. "It is a South African snake, one of the most deadly and poisonous in existence." The reporters wrote, "Extraordinary story. Snake poison in air drama. Deadlier than the cobra." The coroner then called for Monsieur Hercule Poirot. There was a little stir of interest as Monsieur Hercule Poirot identified himself as a detective. But his evidence was very restrained. He had noticed nothing out of the way. The Countess of Horbury was next. The reporters wrote, "Peer's wife gives evidence in air-death mystery." Those who wrote for women's papers put, "Lady Horbury wore one of the new collegian hats and fox furs." Everyone enjoyed looking at the smart and lovely young woman, though her evidence was of the briefest. She had noticed nothing. She had never seen the deceased before. Venetia Carr succeeded her, but was definitely less of a thrill. James Ryder, managing director of the Ellis Vale Cement Company, was called, and asked by the coroner whether he had seen the blowpipe before, or any such thing in anybody's hand on board the Prometheus. Ryder answered that he had not. "You were sitting in seat number 4, immediately in front of the deceased." "What if I was?" "Please do not take that tone with me," said the coroner sternly. "Did any of the people in front of you move from their seats?" "Well, the man 2 seats ahead of me got up and went to the toilet compartment." "That was in a direction away from you. Did he come down the car towards you at all?" "No, he went straight back to his seat." "Was he carrying anything in his hand?" "Nothing at all." "Did anyone else move from his seat?" "The chap in front of me. He came the other way, past me, to the back of the car." "I protest," squeaked Mr. Clancy, springing up from his seat in court. "That was earlier, much earlier, about 1 o'clock. "Kindly sit down," said the coroner. "Proceed, Mr. Ryder. Did you notice if this gentleman had anything in his hands?" "I think he had a fountain pen and an orange book." "Did you yourself leave your seat?" "Yes, I went to the toilet compartment, and I didn't have any blowpipe in my hand either." "You are adopting a highly improper tone." "Please stand down." Mr. Norman Gale, dentist, gave evidence of a negative character. Then the indignant Mr. Clancy took the stand. The reporters wrote, "Mystery story writer admits purchase of deadly weapon. Sensation in court." "I did purchase a blowpipe," said Mr. Clancy shrilly, "and what is more, I have brought it with me today." And he produced the blowpipe with a triumphant flourish. The coroner dealt severely with Mr. Clancy. He was then asked about the occurrences on the Prometheus, but with little result. Miss Jane Grey, hairdresser's assistant, created no flutter among journalistic pens. The 2 Frenchmen followed. Monsieur Armand Dupont said he and his son had been very interested in a technical discussion, and had noticed very little of what went on around them. He had never heard of either Madame Morisot or Madame Giselle. His son followed him. His evidence was a repetition of his father's. He had noticed nothing. He had thought it possible the deceased had been stung by a wasp, because he had himself killed one. The Duponts were the last witnesses. The coroner cleared his throat and addressed the jury. This, he said, was without doubt the most astonishing and incredible case with which he had ever dealt in this court. A woman had been murdered in mid-air, in a small, enclosed space. There was no question of any outside person having committed the crime. The murderer, or murderers, must be, of necessity, one of the witnesses they had heard this morning. In the absence of further evidence, he could only direct the jury to return a verdict of murder against a person or persons unknown. Everyone present had denied any knowledge of the deceased woman. It would be the work of the police to find out how and where a connection lay. As Jane left the court after the inquest, she found Norman Gale beside her. Hercule Poirot passed them with a smile and a bow. "Extraordinary," said Gale. "Calls himself a detective. Any criminal could spot him a mile off. I don't see how he could disguise himself." "Haven't you got a very old-fashioned idea of detectives?" asked Jane. "All the false beard stuff is very out of date. Nowadays detectives think out a case psychologically." "Look here," said Gale. A slight flush rose in his cheeks, and he spoke rather fast. "Would you mind— I mean, it's a bit late, but how about having some tea with me?" Gale's confusion served to accentuate Jane's coolness and self-possession. "Thank you very much," she said. "I would like some tea." The tea shop was nearly empty. Its emptiness served to emphasize the intimacy of tea drinking together. Jane looked at her companion. He was attractive. Those blue eyes and that smile. Gale plunged hastily into talk. "It's a nasty thing, this murder business." "I know," said Jane. Antoine's maid like to employ a girl who's been mixed up in a murder case. A thing like that isn't your fault at all. Well, said Jane, I might be the person who murdered her. And when you've murdered one person, they say you usually murder a lot more. I'd like to murder some of my ladies sometimes, if I was sure I could get away with it. Well, you didn't do this particular murder anyway, said Gale. I can swear to that. And I can swear you didn't do it, said Jane, but that won't help if your patients think you have. Gale said suddenly and impulsively, Perhaps you'll dine with me one night and we might do a show. Thank you. There was a pause, and then Gale said, Jane, who do you think really murdered this Giselle woman? I haven't the slightest idea. Have you? No, said Norman Gale, looking very thoughtful. I don't think I'd realized until today that one of the others must have done it. Murder doesn't concern the victim and the guilty only. It affects the innocent too. You and I are innocent, but the shadow of murder has touched us. Jane was a person of cool common sense, but she shivered suddenly. Don't, she said. You make me feel afraid. I'm a little afraid, myself, said Gale. Poirot made his way to Scotland Yard, where Japp introduced him to a tall, thin man with an intelligent, melancholy face. This is Monsieur Fournier of the Sûreté. I think I have had the pleasure of meeting you once some years ago, Monsieur Poirot, said Fournier, bowing and shaking hands. I suggest, said Poirot, that both you gentlemen should dine with me at my rooms. I have already invited Maître Thibault. That is, if you and my friend Japp do not object to my collaboration. That's all right, old cock, said Japp, slapping him heartily on the back. The Frenchman agreed. We shall indeed be honoured. By common consent, no mention of the case was made during the excellent meal which the little Belgian provided for his friends. After all, it is possible to eat well in England, murmured Fournier. Bit Frenchified, but damn good, pronounced Japp. And now let's hear all you can tell us, Monsieur Thibault, of this Giselle woman. To speak the truth, I know very little. Madame Giselle was what you call in this country a character. She was unique. She was the type of hard-headed Frenchwoman who would never allow sentiment to affect her business interests. But she had the reputation of carrying on her profession with scrupulous honesty. Monsieur Thibault looked for assent to Fournier. Yes, he agreed, she was honest, according to her lights, yet the law could have called her to account if only evidence had been forthcoming. But that, Fournier shrugged his shoulders despondently, it is all too much to ask. With human nature what it is. You mean chantage? Blackmail? Echoed Japp. Blackmail of a peculiar and specialized kind. Poirot leaned forward interestedly. Madame Giselle, continued Fournier, had her own intelligence service. It was her custom before lending a large sum of money to collect as many facts as possible about the client in question, and her intelligence system was an extraordinarily good one. You mean that this secret knowledge was her form of security, said Poirot. Exactly, and in using it she was perfectly ruthless and deaf to any finer shades of feeling. And her system paid. A man or woman in a prominent position would go to desperate lengths to obtain the money which would obviate a public scandal. And supposing, said Poirot, that she did have to write off a bad debt. What then? In that case, said Fournier slowly, the information she held was published, or was given to the person concerned in the matter. There was a moment's silence. Well, said Japp, it opens up a very pretty line in motives for murder. Then there's the question of who is going to come into her money. Can you help us there at all? He appealed to Thibault. "There was a daughter," said the lawyer. "She did not live with her mother. Indeed, I fancy that her mother has never seen her since she was a tiny child, but she made a will many years ago, leaving everything, with the exception of a small legacy to her maid, to her daughter Anne Moffeso. Her fortune must be well over £100,000. "Just as well she wasn't on that plane," said Japp dryly. "She might have been suspected of bumping off her mother." "How old would she be?" "I should imagine about 24 or 5, said the lawyer. "Well," said Japp, "there doesn't seem anything to connect her with the crime. We'll have to get down to this blackmailing business. Everyone on that plane denies knowing Madame Giselle. One of them is lying. An examination of her private papers might help, eh, Fournier?" "My friend," said Fournier, "all those papers have been burnt." "Burnt? Who by? Why?" "Madame Giselle had a confidential maid, Elise. Elise had instructions that in the event of anything happening to her mistress, she was to open the safe and burn the contents." "But that's amazing." Japp stared. "You see," said Fournier, "Madame Giselle had her own code. She kept faith with those who kept faith with her. She was ruthless, but she was also a woman of her word." The 4 men were silent, ruminating on the strange character of the dead woman. Japp shook his head dumbly. "Where do we go from here?" he said. Maître Thibault left to keep an appointment. The 3 men drew their chairs a little closer to the table, where there lay a plan of the plane. "Well now," said Japp, "let's be practical." He unscrewed the cap of his fountain pen. "There were 11 passengers in the plane, in the rear car, I mean. The other doesn't come into it. 11 passengers and 2 stewards. That's 13 people we've got. One of the remaining 12 did the old woman in. Some of the passengers were English, some French. The latter I shall hand over to Monsieur Fournier. The English ones I'll take. Then there are inquiries to be made in Paris. That's your job too, Fournier." "Not only in Paris," said Fournier. "In the summer, Giselle did a lot of business at the French watering places, Deauville, Lupine, Wimereux." "Good point. 1 or 2 people in the Prometheus mentioned Lupine," Japp nodded. "Well, that's one line. Then we've got to get down to the actual murder itself, prove who could possibly be in a position to use that blowpipe. Let's go through the people one by one and decide on the probabilities and, even more important, the possibilities. To begin with, we can eliminate Monsieur Poirot here." Poirot shook his head sadly. "You should trust nobody, my friend. Nobody at all." "Well, we'll leave you in," said Japp good-temperedly. "Then there are the stewards. Unlikely it should be either of them from the probability point of view. On the other hand, from the possibility viewpoint, we've got to include them. They were up and down the car. They could actually have taken up a position from which they could have used that blowpipe, though only about a chance in 100 that it would come off without being noticed." "You think it was a foolish way of committing a murder, yes?" asked Poirot. "Of course it was. The murderer ought to have been spotted 5 or 6 times over," said Japp. "You don't doubt she was killed that way, I suppose?" "No, my friend. The poisoned thorn that I picked up was the cause of death. That is quite certain. Nevertheless, there are points about this case." He paused, shaking his head perplexedly. Japp went on. "Now, the passengers. Let's start up the end by the steward's pantry and the toilets. Seat number 16. That's the hairdressing girl, Jane Grey. Seems rather too small a fish for what we're looking for. And I don't think a hairdresser's assistant had the remotest chance of laying her hands on snake venom. Only about 2 people in 100 would be likely to have any knowledge of it and be able to lay their hands on the stuff. Which makes one thing at least perfectly clear," said Poirot. Fournier shot a quick glance of inquiry at him, but Japp was busy with his own ideas. The murderer has got to fall into one of two categories. Either he's a man who's knocked about the world in distant places, who knows something of snakes and of the habits of the native tribes who use the venom. That's category number one. And the other? The scientific line. This boom slang stuff is the kind of thing they experiment with in high-class laboratories. I had a talk with Winterspoon. Apparently snake venom is used in the treatment of epilepsy. Interesting and suggestive, said Fournier. Yes, but let's go on. Neither of those categories fit the Grey girl. As far as she's concerned, motive seems unlikely. Chances of getting poison, poor. Actual possibility of doing the blowpipe act, almost impossible. If the girl didn't move from her seat, number 16, she couldn't possibly have aimed the thorn to catch Giselle in number 2 on the side of the neck. Now then, Norman Gale, that's the dentist, number 12, opposite the Grey girl. Very much the same applies to him. Small fry. I suppose he did move in circles where you could get access to some funny business in drugs. He did leave his seat, but only to go to the toilet. That's in the opposite direction. But as regards possibility, he's pretty well out of it. I agree, said Fournier. Now to number 17, said Japp. That was my seat originally, said Poirot. I yielded it to one of the ladies, since she desired to be near her friend. That's the Honourable Venetia. Well, what about her? She's a big bug. She might have borrowed from Giselle. The position is possible. If Giselle had got her head turned a little, looking out of the window, the Honourable Venetia could take a sporting shot, or do you call it a sporting puff? What balderdash it all sounds, though. It doesn't make sense. It does seem unlikely, said Fournier. Seat 13, said Japp. Lady Horbury. She's a bit of a dark horse. I shouldn't be surprised if she had a guilty secret or two. I happen to know, said Fournier, that the lady in question has been losing very heavily at the baccarat table at Lupini. That's smart of you. Yes, she's the type of pigeon to be mixed up with Giselle. But how did she do it? She didn't leave her seat either. Seats 9 and 10, said Fournier. Monsieur Hercule Poirot and Dr. Bryant. What about Dr. Bryant? Said Japp. Big bug in Harley Street. Not very likely to go to a Frenchwoman moneylender, but you never know. And if any funny business crops up with a doctor, he's done for life. Well, here's where my scientific theory comes in. A man like Dr. Bryant, at the top of the tree, is in with all the medical research people. He could easily pinch a test tube of snake venom. They check these things, my friend, objected Poirot. It could be done, said Japp, simply because a man like Bryant would be above suspicion. The only thing is, why not say the woman died from heart failure, natural death? Poirot coughed. I fancy, he said, that was the doctor's first, well, shall we say, impression. After all, it looked very like natural death, possibly as the result of a wasp sting. There was a wasp, remember? Not likely to forget that wasp, put in Japp. You're always harping on it. However, continued Poirot, I happened to notice the fatal thorn. Once we had found that, everything pointed to murder. That's true, agreed Japp. I fancy Bryant is definitely on the list of suspects. He could do the blowpipe act diagonally across the car. But why nobody saw him? But whoever did it wasn't seen. And for that I fancy there must be a reason, said Fournier. A reason that, by all I have heard, he smiled, will appeal to Monsieur Poirot. I mean, a psychological reason, a moment when everyone would have their attention fixed on a certain point. That is true, said Poirot. If we discover there was such a psychological moment during the journey of the Prometheus, it must follow logically that the cause of the moment must have originated with the murderer. Jack nodded. Right. I'm carrying now to seat number 8. Daniel Michael Clancy. He spoke the name with a certain amount of relish. In my opinion, he's the most likely suspect we've got. Don't forget, he went down past Giselle's seat, the only one of the passengers who did. And remember, he knows all about blowpipes. He said so. Which makes one pause, perhaps, said Poirot. Japp returned to his plan of the plane. Number 4 was Ryder, the seat slap in front of the dead woman. Didn't think he did it, but he went to the toilet. He could have taken a pot shot on the way back. The only thing is, he'd be right up against the archaeologist fellas. They'd notice, couldn't help it. Poirot shook his head thoughtfully. You are not perhaps acquainted with many archaeologists? If these two were having a really absorbing discussion, eh bien, my friend, they would be existing, you see, in 5,000 or so BC. 1935 AD would have been non-existent to them. Japp looked a little skeptical. What can you tell us about them, Fournier? Monsieur Armand Dupont is one of the most distinguished archaeologists in France. Both he and his son are devoted heart and soul to their profession. It seems to me unlikely that they are mixed up in this business. All right, said Japp. We'll have to do a lot of routine inquiry. I shall take on Clancy and Bryant first. Find out if they've been worried or upset lately. Their movements in the last year, all that sort of stuff. Monsieur Fournier will undertake the Dupont. The man from the Sûreté nodded. I shall return to Paris tonight. There may be something to be got out of Elise, Giselle's maid. Also, I will check up Giselle's movements. She was, I know, at Lupine once or twice. Japp and Fournier both looked at Poirot, who was absorbed in thought. Poirot roused himself. I think I should like to accompany Monsieur Fournier to Paris. Japp looked at Poirot curiously. Got some of your little ideas, eh? One thing that worries me is the place where the blowpipe was found. It is not because it was found pushed down beside my seat that it worries me. It was it being pushed down behind any seat. Whoever did it couldn't risk its being found on him, said Japp. Évidemment, but you may have noticed, my friend, when you examine the plane, that in each window there is a ventilator, a circle of small, round holes in the glass, which can be opened or closed by turning a fan in the glass. Those holes are of sufficient circumference to admit of the passage of our blowpipe. What could be simpler than to get rid of the blowpipe that way? But he did hide the blowpipe behind the cushion of a seat, said Japp. Poirot did not answer, and Fournier asked curiously, It gives you an idea, that? It gives rise to, say, a speculation in my mind. Then Poirot said, turning to Japp, Apropos, have you a detailed list of the belongings of the passengers? Japp grinned and dived into his pockets, bringing out a mass of closely typewritten paper. Here you are. And there is one rather curious thing in it. I'll be interested to know what you think when you finish reading the stuff. Poirot spread out the sheets on the table and began to read. Fournier moved up and read them over his shoulder. James Ryder. Pockets, linen handkerchief marked J, pigskin note case, 7 £1 notes, 3 business cards. Letter from partner George Eberman, hoping that loan has been successfully negotiated, otherwise we're up the creek. Letter, sheet paper, illiterate handwriting, signed, Mordy. Silver cigarette case, fountain pen, bunch of keys, loose change. Attaché case, mass of papers concerning dealings in cement, box of immediate cold cures. Dr. Bryant, pockets, 2 linen handkerchiefs, note case containing £20 and 500 francs. Engagement book, cigarette case, lighter, fountain pen, keys. Flute in case. Carrying Memoirs of Benvenuto Cellini. Norman Gale, pockets, silk handkerchief, wallet containing £1 in English and 600 francs. Loose change, business cards of 2 French firms, makers of dental instruments. Bryant and May matchbox, empty. Silver lighter, briar pipe, rubber tobacco pouch. Attaché case, white linen coat, 2 small dental mirrors, dental rolls of cotton wool, La Vie Parisienne, the Strand magazine, the autocar. Armand Dupont. Pockets, wallet containing 1,000 francs and £10 in English. Spectacles in case, cotton handkerchief, loose change, packet of cigarettes, match folder, cards in case, toothpick. Attaché case, manuscript of proposed address to the Royal Asiatic Society, 2 German archaeological publications, ornamental hollow tubes said to be Kurdish pipe stems, 9 unmounted photographs, all of pottery. Jean Dupont. Pockets, note case containing £5 in English and 300 francs. Cigarette case, cigarette holder, ivory, lighter, fountain pen, small notebook, loose change. Daniel Clancy. Pockets, handkerchief, ink-stained, fountain pen, leaking. 3 newspaper cuttings dealing with recent crimes. 4 pencils, penknife, notebook containing suggestions for plots, loose change in Italian, French, Swiss, and English money. Keys. Overcoat pockets, manuscript notes of Murder on Vesuvius, Continental Bradshaw, golf ball, pair of socks, toothbrush. Miss Carr. Vanity bag, lipstick, a jade cigarette holder, powder compact, cigarette case, match folder, handkerchief, £2 English, keys. Dressing case, bottles, brushes, combs, etc. Manicure outfit, washing bag, scissors, 5 letters from family and friends in England, photograph of 2 spaniels, 2 popular novels. Carried, Vogue, and Good Housekeeping. Miss Gray. Handbag, lipstick, rouge, powder compact. Keys, pencil, cigarette case, match folder, hotel bill, Le Pinet, small book, French phrases, note case, 100 francs and 10 shillings. 1 casino counter, value 5 francs. In pocket of travelling coat, 6 postcards of Paris and silk scarf. Tube of aspirin. Lady Horbury, vanity bag, 2 lipsticks, rouge, powder compact, handkerchief, 3 1,000 franc notes, £6 English, a diamond ring, 2 cigarette holders, lighter with case. Dressing case, complete makeup outfit, elaborate manicure set, gold, small bottle labelled in ink, boracic powder. As Poirot came to the end of the list, Japp laid his finger on the last item. Boracic powder, my eye. The white powder in that bottle was cocaine. Poirot nodded his head slowly. On the face of it, he said, it seems to point very plainly to one person as having committed the crime. And yet I cannot see why, or even how. Japp stared at him. Are you pretending that by reading all this stuff you've got an idea who did it? I think so, said Poirot. But it is a theory. I have found the right clue on the wrong person. That means there is much work to be done, and truly there is much that is still obscure to me. Well, let's call it a day, said Japp, rising. I work the London end, you return to Paris Fournier with Monsieur Poirot. The 2 detectives departed. Poirot remained for a time as in a dream. Then he went to a side table and picked up a copy of the sketch. He turned the pages until he came to the one he sought. 2 sun-worshippers, it was headed. The Countess of Horbury and Mr. Raymond Barraclough at Le Pinet. He looked at the 2 laughing figures clad in bathing dresses, their arms entwined. I wonder, said Hercule Poirot. One might do something along those lines. The weather on the following day was so perfect, that even Hercule Poirot had to admit that his stomach was perfectly peaceful. On this occasion they were travelling by the 8:45 air service to Paris. There were 7 or 8 travellers beside Poirot and Fournier in the compartment, and the Frenchman utilized the journey to make some experiments. He took from his pocket a small piece of bamboo, and 3 times he raised this to his lips, pointing it in a certain direction. On each occasion he caught the eye of some passenger or other, eyeing him with mild astonishment. Fournier sank in his seat discouraged, and was but little cheered by Poirot's open amusement. "You agree one must try experiments?" "Évidemment," said Poirot. "On each occasion there is somebody who does not see you. But for a successful murder, you must be reasonably sure that nobody will see you." "I hold then to my theory," said Fournier, "that there must have been a psychological moment when everyone's attention was mathematically centered elsewhere. Do you not agree, Monsieur Poirot?" "I agree, but I fear that in this case mere ocular facts may be deceptive. Use the eye of the brain, not of the body. Let the little grey cells of the mind function. Let it be their task to show you what actually happened." And leaning back, Poirot closed his eyes. 5 minutes later, he was fast asleep. On arrival in Paris, they went straight to number 3 Rue Joliette. An aged concierge admitted them and retreated, grumbling. "We will go to Giselle's office," said Fournier. "It is on the 1st floor." Madame Giselle's office was a small, stuffy apartment. It had a somewhat old-fashioned type of safe in a corner, a writing desk of business-like appearance, and several shabbily upholstered chairs. The one window was dirty, and it seemed highly probable that it had never been opened. Fournier shrugged his shoulders as he looked round. "You see," he said, "nothing at all." Poirot looked across at the safe. "Not a very efficacious pattern, that. It was empty?" "Yes, that cursed maid destroyed everything." "Ah, yes. Let us see this highly confidential maid." Elise Grandier was a short, stout woman of middle age, with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes. "Monsieur Poirot and I have returned today from London," said Fournier. "The inquest took place yesterday. There is no doubt whatsoever. Madame was poisoned." The Frenchwoman shook her head gravely. "It is terrible, monsieur, or would ever have sought it. But I know nothing at all." "Mademoiselle Grandier," said Fournier dryly, "the profession of a moneylender, it entails certain unpleasantnesses." "It is true that sometimes the clients of Madame were not very reasonable," agreed Elise. "Madame Giselle was a hard woman." Elise spoke with impatience. "Madame was always fair and just. She lent, and she expected repayment." Fournier said, "Madame's clients usually managed to pay, in the end. Were you aware of the means Madame used to compel them?" "I know nothing, monsieur, nothing at all." "But you knew enough to burn Madame's papers?" "I was following her instructions." "You burnt the papers in the office safe?" asked Poirot. "That is right, business papers." "And they were in the office safe?" His persistence brought the red up in Elise's cheeks. "I obeyed Madame's instructions," she said. "I know that," said Poirot, smiling, "but the papers were not in the safe." "That is so, is it not? That safe, it is far too old-fashioned. Quite an amateur might have opened it. The papers were kept elsewhere. In Madame's bedroom, perhaps?" Elise paused a moment. "Yes, that is so. The safe was a blind. Everything was in Madame's bedroom." "Will you show us where?" Elise rose, and the 2 men followed her. In one corner of the bedroom was a large, old-fashioned trunk. Elise lifted the lid and took out an old-fashioned alpaca dress with a silk underskirt. On the inside of the dress was a deep pocket. "The papers were in this, monsieur," she said, "in a large sealed envelope." "You told me nothing of this when I questioned you 3 days ago," said Fournier sharply. "It is possible that Madame was murdered by a person or persons about whom she had certain damaging knowledge. That knowledge was in those papers you burnt. It is possible that you glanced through those papers before committing them to the flames." Elise leant forward and spoke emphatically. "No, monsieur, I looked at nothing. I read nothing. I burnt the envelope without undoing the seal." Fournier stared hard at her for a moment or two. Then, satisfied she was speaking the truth, he turned away with a gesture of discouragement. "Mademoiselle Grandier, had Madame Giselle been in Paris before her journey to England?" asked Poirot. "She returned to Paris from her business in the resorts on the afternoon before." "Now think, mademoiselle, did she say anything at all that might be of use?" "I cannot remember anything. Madame was in good spirits. Her tour had been profitable. She directed me to ring up Universal Airlines and book a passage to England for the following day. The early morning service was booked, but she obtained a seat on the 12 o'clock service." "Did any clients come to see Madame that evening?" "I believe there was one client, monsieur, but I am not sure. Georges, the concierge, perhaps would know." Fournier took from his pockets various photographs, mostly snapshots taken by reporters of various witnesses leaving the coroner's court. "Can you recognize any of these, mademoiselle?" "No, monsieur." Fournier rose. "Well, mademoiselle, we will take our leave. Monsieur Poirot, you are looking for something?" Poirot was wandering round the room. "I am looking for something I do not see. Photographs of Madame Giselle's relations, her family." "Madame was alone in the world," said Elise. "She had a daughter?" said Poirot sharply. "Yes," Elise sighed. "It is my belief that Madame had never seen that daughter since she was a tiny baby. Madame was young. She may have been married. Myself, I think not. Doubtless some arrangement was made about the child." "But she left her money to this daughter." "Who should one leave one's money to, except one's own flesh and blood?" demanded Elise. "Well, we will take our leave," said Fournier, "and I will have another word with old Georges." "Permit me to follow you in a little minute, my friend," said Poirot. Fournier departed. Poirot roamed once more round the room, then sat down and fixed his eyes on Elise. Under his scrutiny, the Frenchwoman got slightly restive. "Mademoiselle Grandier," he said, "there is something that you conceal. Everyone keeps something back. That is so with you. Will you not tell me what it is? Remember, I am not of the police." A look of indecision came over her face. "You are a good watchdog, Elise. It is a question, I see, of loyalty to your dead mistress. Madame was good to me. I do not mind admitting it. I had been deceived, monsieur, my savings stolen, and there was a child. It was then that she mentioned to me that she too was a mother." "Did she tell you any details?" "No, monsieur. She spoke of a part of her life that was over and done with. It was best so, she said. The little girl was well provided for and would inherit her money when she died." "She told you nothing further about this child or its father?" "No, monsieur, but I have an idea that the father of the child was an Englishman. There was a bitterness in Madame's voice when she spoke of the English." There was a pause. "Now, Mademoiselle Elise," said Poirot, "what is this something that you have hitherto refrained from mentioning?" Elise rose and left the room. She returned with a small, shabby black notebook. This little book was Madame's. It went everywhere with her. After she had departed for England, I found it. It had dropped down behind the head of the bed. I burned the papers as soon as I heard of Madame's death, but I did not burn the book." Unwillingly she held out the book to Poirot. There were penciled entries in a sloping foreign writing. They seemed to be all of the same kind, a number followed by a few descriptive details. There were perhaps 20 in all. At the end of the book were penciled memoranda of dates or places, such as Lupine, Monday, Casino, 10:30. Savoy Hotel, 5 o'clock. ABC Fleet Street, 11 o'clock. None of these were complete in themselves, and seemed to have been put down less as actual appointments than as aids to Giselle's memory. Poirot closed the book and put it in his pocket. "This may be very valuable, mademoiselle. You did wisely to give it to me. Having had no instructions, it is your duty to hand it over to the police. I will arrange matters with Monsieur Fournier so that you shall not be blamed for not having done so sooner." Poirot rose. "Just one last question. When you reserved a seat in the aeroplane for Madame Giselle, did you ring up the aerodrome at Le Bourget or the office of the company?" "I rang the office of Universal Airlines." Poirot made a note in his little book. Then, with a friendly nod, he left the room. Downstairs he found Fournier deep in conversation with old Georges, the concierge. The detective was looking hot and annoyed. "It is the truth that I have been telling you," said Georges. "Yes, a woman did come to see Madame the night before she left for England. You show me those photographs. I tell you it was growing dark. My present eyesight is not so good. I did not recognize the lady. There, you have it plainly for the 4th or 5th time." Poirot forestalled an angry retort on Fournier's part by slipping a tactful arm through that of his friend. "Come, mon vieux, the stomach calls. A simple but satisfying meal, that is what I prescribe." Fournier glared at Georges. Poirot smiled encouragingly at the old man. "The nameless lady, was she chic?" "Chic?" said Georges, rather taken aback. "I am answered. She was chic, and I have a little idea, my friend, that she would look well in a bathing dress. Do you not agree? See, here." He passed the old man a page torn from the sketch. The old man gave a very slight start. "You agree, do you not?" asked Poirot. Georges condescended to give a hoarse chuckle. Over the meal, the little Belgian produced the little black book. Fournier was much excited, though distinctly irate with Elise. In the interval between the omelette and the sole, Fournier turned the pages of the black book. Occasionally he made a penciled entry in his notebook. When the cheese was placed before them, Poirot took the book from Fournier, and the eyes of the two men met. "There are certain entries," began Fournier. "5," said Poirot. "I agree, 5. Fournier read out from his pocketbook. "CL 52, English peeress, husband. RT 362, doctor, Harley Street. MR 42, forged antiquities. XVB 724, English, embezzlement. GF 45, attempted murder, English." "Excellent, my friend," said Poirot. "Of all the entries, those 5 also seem to me the only ones that can in any way bear a relation to the persons travelling in the aeroplane." "English peeress, husband," said Fournier. "That may conceivably apply to Lady Robbery. She is, I understand, a confirmed gambler. Nothing could be more likely than that she should borrow money from Giselle. The word husband may have one of 2 meanings. Either Giselle expected the husband to pay up, or she had some hold over Lady Horbury which she threatened to reveal to her husband." "I favour the second one myself," said Poirot. especially as I would be prepared to bet that the woman who visited Giselle the night before the aeroplane journey was Lady Horbury. To continue from the little book, said Fournier. RT 362 Dr. Harley Street. A possible clue to Dr. Bryant, said Poirot. Nothing much to go on, but we must not neglect that line of investigation. MR24 Forged Antiquities, read Fournier. That might apply to the Dupont. I can hardly credit it. Monsieur Dupont is an archaeologist of worldwide reputation. A high reputation is the first necessity of a swindler's stock in trade, said Poirot. But let us return to our list. XVB 724, read Fournier, is very ambiguous. English, embezzlement. Not very helpful, agreed Poirot. Monsieur Ryder is the only representative of commerce. He may have embezzled money. As to the last entry, GF45, attempted murder, English, that gives a very wide field. Only the Duponts are exempt by reason of their nationality. At the Sûreté, Poirot renewed acquaintance with the chief of the detective force, whom he had met some years previously in the course of one of his cases. Monsieur Gilles was affable and polite. A poisoned dart from a blowpipe in an aeroplane. I ask you, is it possible that such a thing could happen? Exactly, cried Poirot. Exactly. You hit the nail upon the head. Ah, here is Fournier. You have news, I see. The melancholy-faced Fournier was looking quite eager and excited. A Greek antique dealer, Zeropoulos, has reported the sale of a blowpipe and darts 3 days before the murder. I propose to interview this man. The shop of Monsieur Zeropoulos was in the Rue Saint-Honoré. It was by way of being a high-class antique dealer's and was patronized chiefly by American tourists and knowledgeable connoisseurs. Monsieur Zeropoulos himself was a short, stout little man. He talked volubly and at great length. Yes, he had sold a blowpipe and darts, a South American curio. He had had them for a long time, and nobody had noticed it until along came this American. An American? Said Fournier sharply. Yes, an American, unmistakably, the kind that knows nothing about anything. Very quickly I size him up. He asks the price, and I tell him. I wait for him to bargain, but straight away he pays my price. I am stupefied. Afterwards I read in the paper of this astonishing murder. I wonder, yes, I wonder very much, and I communicate with the police. We are much obliged to you, Monsieur Zeropoulos, said Fournier politely. This blowpipe and darts, you think you would be able to identify them? The blowpipe was about so long. Monsieur Zeropoulos measured a space on his desk. And so thick, like this pen of mine. It was of a light color. There were 4 darts. They were long pointed thorns, slightly discolored at the tips, with a little fluff of red silk on them. Red silk? Said Poirot keenly. That is curious, said Fournier. You are sure that there was not one of them with a black and yellow fluff of silk? Black and yellow? No, monsieur. Fournier glanced at Poirot. There was a curious, satisfied smile on the little man's face. Fournier wondered why. I should like as full a description as possible of this American, he said. It was just an American, Monsieur Zeropoulos replied. He could not speak French, he had tortoise-shell glasses, he was tall, and I think not very old. He was not remarkable in any way. Fournier showed him the collection of snapshots, but without avail. Probably a wild goose chase, said Fournier as they left the shop. I do not think so, said Poirot. The price tickets were of the same shape as that remaining on the blowpipe on the plane, and there are 1 or 2 points of interest about the story and about Monsieur Zeropoulos's remarks. Now, my friend, indulge me, and come upon another wild goose chase. Where to? To the office of Universal Airlines? Of course, said Fournier, but we have already made perfunctory inquiries there. Poirot tapped him kindly on the shoulder. "I have a certain little idea." The office of Universal Airlines was quite small. A smart-looking man was behind a highly polished wooden counter. Fournier produced his credentials, and the man, whose name was Hercule Poirot, looked pleasantly excited. "It is in this matter of the murder of Madame Giselle," said Fournier. "Now she received her place. When?" "She booked her seat by telephone on the 17th. "That was for the 12 o'clock service on the following day?" said Poirot. "Yes, monsieur." "But I understand from her maid that it was on the 8:45 a.m. service that Madame reserved a seat." No. This is what happened. Madame's maid asked for the 8:45, but that service was already booked up, so we gave her a seat on the 12 o'clock instead." I see, said Poirot. "But all the same, it is curious." The clerk looked at him inquiringly. "It is only that a friend of mine decided to go to England at a moment's notice, and went on the 8:45 service that morning, and the plane was half empty." Monsieur Poirot turned over some pages. He blew his nose. The mild, inquiring gaze of Hercule Poirot seemed to be upsetting him. "Don't you think," said Poirot, "that it might perhaps be better to make a clean breast of the matter?" "Clean breast of what?" Come, said Hercule Poirot. "This is a case of murder. If you withhold information, it may well be very serious for you." Jules Poirot stared at him. His mouth fell open. His hands shook. "Now," said Poirot. His voice was authoritative, autocratic. "We want precise information, if you please. How much were you paid? And who paid you?" 5,000 francs. I never saw the man before. This will ruin me." "Tell us exactly how it happened." Jules spoke rapidly, in little jerks. "A man came in. He wanted to negotiate a loan from Madame Giselle. He knew she was going to England on the following day. All I had to do was to tell her the early service was full up, and to give her seat number 2 in the Prometheus. Monsieur, I saw nothing wrong in that. Americans, they do business in unconventional ways." "Describe this American." "He was tall, stooped, had grey hair, horn-rimmed glasses, and a little goatee beard." "Did he book a seat himself?" "Yes, monsieur, seat number 1, next to the one I was to keep for Madame Giselle." "In what name?" Silas Harper." Poirot shook his head gently. "I saw by the paper that there was no one of that name," Jules Poirot said. "That is why I thought there was no need to mention the matter." Outside on the pavement, Fournier removed his hat and bowed. "I salute you, Monsieur Poirot. What gave you this idea?" "2 separate sentences. One, this morning, when I heard a man in our plane say that he had crossed on the morning of the murder in a nearly empty plane. The second was that uttered by Elise, when she said that she had rung up the office of Universal Airlines and that there was no room on the early morning service. Now, those 2 statements did not agree. I remembered the steward on the Prometheus saying that he had seen Madame Giselle before on the early service, so it was clearly her custom to go by the 8:45 a.m. plane. But somebody wanted her to go on the 12 o'clock. Somebody who was already traveling by the Prometheus." "Every minute this case gets more puzzling," cried Fournier. Poirot nodded gently. "It's so easy, my friend, to be an American in Paris. The stage American." He took from his pocket the page he had torn from the sketch. "No," said Fournier, "she has been an actress, but she could not impersonate a tall, stooping American. No, my friend, that idea will not do." "I never said it would," said Hercule Poirot. And still he looked earnestly at the printed page. Lord Horbury stood by the sideboard and helped himself absent-mindedly to kidneys. Stephen Horbury was 27 years of age. He looked very much what he was, a sporting, out-of-door kind of man, without anything very spectacular in the way of brains. He took his heaped plate back to the table and began to eat. Presently he opened a newspaper, but immediately, with a frown, he cast it aside. He rose to his feet and went upstairs. Cicely Horbury was in bed, a great carved Elizabethan bed. Very lovely she looked, too, in her rose chiffon draperies, with the curling gold of her hair. She was opening letters. Her maid was moving about the room. The charming picture his wife presented affected Lord Horbury not at all. He said abruptly, "I'd like to talk to you alone." "Madeline," Lady Horbury spoke to her maid, "leave all that. Get out." The French girl murmured, "Très bien, my lady," shot a quick, interested look out of the corner of her eye at Lord Horbury, and left the room. "Cicely, had you been borrowing from that old French moneylender? The woman who was murdered on the plane from Paris?" "No, of course not." "Now, don't be a fool over this, Cicely," Stephen Horbury said sharply. "If you did have dealings with this Giselle, you can be sure that the police will find out." Cicely sat up angrily in bed. "Perhaps you think I killed her. You'd be dead if I died tomorrow." "Aren't you exaggerating a little? In any case, old-fashioned though you think me, I do happen to care about my family name." Turning abruptly on his heel, Lord Horbury left the room. He whistled, and a spaniel came running to him, looking up at him with adoring, sentimental eyes. Cramming an old fishing hat on his head, he left the house, accompanied by the dog. He was walking along a narrow lane when he met Venetia Carr upon her bay mare. Venetia looked her best upon a horse. Lord Horbury looked up at her in admiration, fondness, and a strange sense of homecoming. They talked horses for some minutes. Then he said, "Look here, Venetia, was Cicely mixed up with this woman Giselle in any way?" "Well, candidly, I shouldn't be surprised." Stephen nodded thoughtfully. "This is her affair, not yours," Venetia said gently. "As long as she's my wife, it's bound to be my business too." "Would you divorce her if you had the chance?" "If I had a cause, I certainly would." "I suppose," said Venetia thoughtfully, "she knows that." "Yes." They were both silent. Then he said, "If I were free, Venetia, would you marry me?" Looking very straight between her horse's ears, Venetia said in a voice carefully devoid of emotion, "I suppose I would." Stephen. She'd always loved Stephen, and Stephen had been fond of her, but not fond enough to prevent him from falling desperately, wildly, madly in love with a clever, calculating cat of a chorus girl. "Well, Stephen," she said, "I'll be getting along." As she rounded the corner of the lane, Venetia dropped her whip. A man walking picked it up and returned it to her with an exaggerated bow. A foreigner, she thought as she thanked him. I seem to remember his face. Only as she reached home did memory suddenly pull her up with a jerk. The little man who gave me his seat in the aeroplane. They said at the inquest he was a detective. And hard on that came another thought. What is he doing down here? Jane presented herself at Antoine's on the morning after the inquest with some trepidation of spirit. The person who was usually regarded as Monsieur Antoine himself, and whose real name was Andrew Leach, greeted her with an ominous frown. It was by now second nature to him to speak in broken English once within the portals of Bruton Street. He upbraided Jane as a complete imbecile. Why did she wish to travel by air anyway? Then, having vented his spleen to the full, she was finally permitted to escape. Jane entered a cubicle where a henna-haired woman was sitting, waiting. "Good morning, madam," said Jane with that airy brightness expected of her, and which she could now produce quite mechanically and without any effort whatsoever. "Tell me," the woman subjected her to a piercing stare, "are you the girl who gave evidence at the inquest yesterday? The girl in the aeroplane?" "Yes, madam." "How too terribly thrilling! Tell me about it." Jane did her best to please. This first ordeal was only a forerunner of many others, all on the same lines. Everyone wanted to be done by the girl who was on the plane. By the end of the week, Jane felt her nerves giving way under the strain. Sometimes she felt that if she had to go through the recital once again, she would scream or attack her questioner with the dryer. However, in the end, she hit upon a better way of relieving her feelings. She approached Monsieur Antoine and boldly demanded a rise of salary. "I'm a draw in this place," said Jane coolly. "I'd easily get what I want from Henri's or the Maison Richer." Because he feared that this was indeed so, grumblingly, Monsieur Antoine agreed to Jane's demands. Thereafter Jane's narrative, repeated daily, with little variation, sank into the equivalent of a part played on the stage. The promised dinner and theatre with Norman Gale had duly come off. It was one of those enchanting evenings, when every word and confidence exchanged seemed to reveal a bond of sympathy and shared tastes. Norman had suggested dinner again on Saturday evening. At lunchtime on Saturday, when Jane received her augmented pay, so full of exuberance did she feel that she decided to be extravagant. She had lunch at the corner house and enjoyed the accompaniment of music to her food. She seated herself at a table for 4, where there were already a middle-aged woman and a young man sitting. Jane, as was her custom, read a book as she ate. Looking up as she turned a page, she noticed the young man opposite her staring at her very intently, and at the same moment realized that his face was vaguely familiar to her. "Excuse me, mademoiselle, you do not recognize me?" "We have not been introduced, it is true," went on the young man, "unless you call murder an introduction, and the fact that we both gave evidence in the coroner's court." "Of course," said Jane. "How stupid of me. I thought I knew your face. You are—" "Jean Dupont," said the man, and gave a funny, rather engaging little bow. Jean Dupont's face, as he leaned across the table, held more than mere interested politeness. He was pleased to be sitting opposite Jane. Jane thought to herself with a touch of misgiving, "He's French, though. You've got to look out with the French. They always say so." "The police, they have not made an arrest yet?" said Jean Dupont. "No, there's not even been anything about it in the papers lately," said Jane. "Who do you think did it? I've wondered and wondered." Jean Dupont shrugged his shoulders. "It was not I. An ugly old woman like Giselle. Who would want to bother to kill her?" "Well, that's one way of looking at it," said Jane, and went on, "You're an archaeologist, aren't you?" And she listened with keen attention while Jean Dupont talked of his work. Jane gave a little sigh at last. "You've been in so many countries. You've seen so much, and I shall never go anywhere or see anything." Suddenly she looked up at the clock and hastily summoned the waitress for her bill. Jean Dupont said with a little embarrassment, "Mademoiselle, I wonder if you would permit, as I have to return to Paris tomorrow, if you would dine with me tonight?" "I'm so sorry, I can't. I'm dining with someone." He stood holding Jane's hand in his for a moment. "I shall hope to see you again, very much," he said. At about the time that Jane was leaving Antoine's to go to lunch, Norman Gale was saying in a hearty, professional tone, "That's a little tender, I'm afraid. Let me see, it's next Tuesday you're coming for those others." His patient, rinsing her mouth ardently, burst into a fluent explanation. She was going away. So sorry, would have to cancel the next appointment. And she escaped hurriedly from the room. Norman Gale's face hardened. Every day the same. People ringing up, cancelled appointments. All varieties of excuses, going away, going abroad, got a cold, may not be here. It didn't matter what reason they gave, the real reason Norman had just seen, quite unmistakably in his last patient's eye as he reached for the drill, a look of sudden panic. Of course, he was in that aeroplane when the woman was murdered. The man might be a homicidal maniac. Norman dropped some instruments into the sterilizer, thinking hard. This business is about done for me professionally. Funny, it's done well for Jane. He smiled. I feel it's going to be all right. Jane's adorable. I want her. She cares. She'll wait. Damn it, I shall go to Canada and make money there. He laughed to himself. It was that same evening that he dined with Jane. Half unconsciously he pretended to be in very high spirits, but Jane was too astute to be deceived. She said at last, Norman, are things going badly? Are people fighting shy? Of having their teeth attended to by a possible murderer, said Norman. Yes. I'm just annoyed, because frankly, Jane, I'm a jolly good dentist, and I'm not a murderer. It's wicked, replied Jane. Somebody ought to do something. I'd like to do something, he said. If I was a young man in a book, I'd find a clue, or I'd shadow somebody. Jane tugged suddenly at his sleeve. Look, there's Mr. Clancy, you know, the author, sitting over there by the wall by himself. We might shadow him. Jane's enthusiasm was infectious. When at last little Mr. Clancy rose and passed out into Dean Street, Norman and Jane were fairly close on his heels. His direction was erratic. Once he actually took so many right-angle turns that he traversed the same street twice over. Jane felt her spirits rise. You see? He's afraid of being followed. He's trying to put us off the scent. They had turned a corner rather quickly and had almost cannoned into their quarry. He was standing, staring up at a butcher's shop. He said aloud, Perfect! The very thing! He took out a little book and wrote something down very carefully. Then he started off again at a brisk pace, heading for Bloomsbury. Mr. Clancy finally stopped at the house, opened the door with a key, and went in. Norman and Jane looked at each other. It's his own house, said Norman. A voice came out of the darkness. Good evening, it said. The owner of the voice stepped forward. A pair of magnificent moustaches showed in the lamplight. Eh bien, said Hercule Poirot, a fine evening for the chase, is it not? Of the two startled young people, it was Norman Gale who recovered himself first. Of course, he said, it's Monsieur Poirot. Ah, said Poirot, and it is the poor Mr. Clancy you suspect? So do you, said Jane acutely, or you wouldn't be here. Poirot looked at her thoughtfully for a moment, then became suddenly brisk. Come now, I have affairs to see to. Since our aims are the same, we three let us combine together. I am about to call upon our ingenious friend, Mr. Clancy. I would suggest that Mademoiselle accompanies me in the guise of my secretary. Here, Mademoiselle, is a notebook and a pencil for the shorthand. I can't write shorthand, said Jane. But you can make plausible signs in the book, can you not? Good. As for Mr. Gale, I suggest that he meets us in, say, an hour's time. Shall we say upstairs at Monseigneur's? Bon. And forthwith he advanced to the bell and pressed it. Gale opened his mouth to protest, then seemed to think better of it. Poirot realized at once the force of Mr. Clancy's announcement at Croydon to the effect that he was not a tidy man. The room was in a state of chaos. There were papers strewn about, cardboard files, bananas, bottles of beer, open books, sofa cushions, a trombone, miscellaneous china, etchings, and a bewildering assortment of fountain pens. In the middle of this confusion, Mr. Clancy was struggling with a camera and a roll of film. "Dear me," said Mr. Clancy, looking up as the visitors were announced by his landlady. "You remember me, I hope?" said Poirot. "This is my secretary, Miss Gray. We were fellow passengers on an aeroplane from Paris on a certain fatal occasion." "Why, of course," said Mr. Clancy, "and Miss Gray, too. Only I had some idea that she was in a beauty parlour." Jane looked anxiously at Poirot. The latter was equal to the situation. "Perfectly correct," he said. "As an efficient secretary, Miss Gray has at times to undertake certain work of a temporary nature." "Of course," said Mr. Clancy. "Do sit down, Miss Gray. No, not there. I think there's some orange juice on that chair. You sit here, Monsieur Poirot. The back is not really broken. Well, perhaps it's best not to lean too hard. Have some beer?" "I thank you, no." "I can guess what you've come about. The murder of Giselle. Say what you like. It's amazing. Poison darts and a blowpipe in an aeroplane. You know, I'm writing the whole thing exactly as it happened, only as fiction, of course." Poirot lowered his voice confidentially. "Mr. Clancy, you are a man of brains and imagination. I, Hercule Poirot, desire to consult you." Mr. Clancy flushed with pleasure. "It would be of great interest to me," continued Poirot, "to consider the case together." "There's a daughter who comes into money, so I've heard," said Mr. Clancy. "But a lot of people on board might benefit for all we know. That is, if they owed her money and haven't got it to pay it back." "I can think of other solutions," said Poirot. "Let us suppose that Madame Giselle knew of something. Attempted murder, shall we say, on the part of one of those people on board." "What a very curious suggestion," said Mr. Clancy. "In cases such as these," said Poirot, "one must think of everything." "Ah," said Mr. Clancy, "but it's no good thinking. You've got to know." "A very just observation." "Bien." Poirot rose. "And now I will take my departure, with 1,000 thanks for your amiability." "Oh," said Mr. Clancy, "I wish you would have had a banana, huh? One thing you must allow me to give you." He darted to a bookcase and came back with a book in his hand. "The Clue of the Scarlet Petal. I think I mentioned at Croydon that book of mine dealt with arrow poison and native darts." 1,000 thanks. You are too amiable." Mr. Clancy shook hands with them both. "I wish I could have been more helpful." From Mr. Clancy's house they took a taxi to the Monseigneur, where they found Norman Gale awaiting them. Poirot ordered some consommé and a chaud-froid of chicken. "Well," said Norman, "how did you get on?" "This," said Poirot, "is how one must proceed. Suspect everyone in turn and wipe him or her off the list." "How many wiped off so far?" asked Jane. "Not as many as you might think, mademoiselle," said Poirot with a twinkle. "I don't want to butt in on official secrets," said Norman, "but is there no record of this woman, the moneylender's dealings?" Poirot shook his head. "All the records are burnt. But it seems Madame Giselle combined a little blackmailing with her profession of money-lending. Supposing, for instance, that Madame Giselle had knowledge of, say, an attempted murder on the part of someone." "Is there any reason to suppose such a thing?" asked Norman Gale. "Why, yes," said Poirot slowly. "There is. One of the few pieces of documentary evidence that we have in this case." He looked from one to the other of their interested faces, and gave a little sigh. "Ah well," he said, "that is that. Let us talk of other matters. For instance, how this tragedy has affected the lives of you two young people." Jane related her salary rise, then Norman explained his position. "Maybe I should chuck up the whole dentistry thing, go out to Canada or somewhere and start again," he said. "If I discover who killed Madame Giselle, you will not have to go," said Poirot cheerfully. "I should solve this problem quicker if I had help from Mr. Gale." "What can I do?" asked Norman. Very delicately, so as not to offend English susceptibilities, Poirot used a toothpick. Then he said, "Frankly, what I need is a blackmailer." Norman stared at Poirot as a man does who cannot believe his ears. "Here is the plan. You will write a note, that is to say, I will write a note and you will copy it to the Countess of Horbury. In the note you will ask for an interview. You will recall yourself to her memory as having travelled to England by air on a certain occasion. You will also refer to certain business dealings of Madame Giselle's having passed into your hands." "And then?" asked Norman. "And then you will be accorded an interview. You will go and will say certain things in which I shall instruct you. You will ask for, let me see, £10,000. "I don't like the idea of blackmail." "There will be no blackmail," said Poirot. "You only have to produce a certain effect. After that, when the ground is prepared, I will step in." Norman said, "If you land me in prison—" "If anything should occur," said Poirot, "I will take the blame. But nothing will." Norman surrendered with a sigh. "Good," said Poirot. "This is what you will write." He dictated slowly. "Voila," he said. "Now, tell me, mademoiselle, have you ever seen a play called Down Under?" "Yes, it's rather good." "An American play, is it not?" "Yes." "Do you remember the part of Henry, played by Mr. Raymond Barraclough?" "Yes. He was very good." "I must go and see him," said Poirot. Jane stared at him, puzzled. What an odd little man he was, hopping from subject to subject like a bird from one branch to another. "That talk of attempted murder," Jane said suddenly, "was that a test?" "You are very quick, mademoiselle. I mention attempted murder, and I watch Mr. Clancy. I watch you, I watch Mr. Gale. And in neither of you three is there a sign, not so much as the flicker of an eyelash." "The horrible, tricky sort of person you are, Monsieur Poirot," said Jane. "I suppose you've got very clever ways of finding out things." "There is only one simple way, to let people tell you. Everyone likes talking about themselves. You yourself, mademoiselle, do you not like to dwell on your childhood memories, on your mother and your father?" "I was brought up in an orphanage. It was quite fun, really." "It was in England?" inquired Poirot. "No, in Ireland, near Dublin." "Ah, so you are Irish. That is why you have the dark hair and the blue-grey eyes." Jane laughed as she got up. "You'll turn my head, Monsieur Poirot. Good night, and thank you for supper." When Poirot got home, he unlocked a drawer and took out a list of 11 names. Against 4 of these names he put a light tick. Then he nodded his head thoughtfully. "I think I know," he murmured to himself. "But I have got to be sure. Il faut continuer." Mr. Henry Mitchell was just sitting down to a supper of sausage and mash when a visitor called to see him. Somewhat to the steward's astonishment, the visitor in question was the full-moustached gentleman who had been one of the passengers on the fatal plane. Monsieur Poirot was very affable. He insisted on Mr. Mitchell's getting on with his supper, and paid a graceful compliment to Mrs. Mitchell, who was standing staring at him, open-mouthed. He accepted a chair. "Scotland Yard, I fear, is not making much progress with the case," he said. "Blowpipes and darts, heathen I call it," said Mrs. Mitchell, with an indignant and patriotic snort. "You are right, madame," said Poirot, addressing her with a flattering air of being struck by her remark. "You know, Mrs. Mitchell, I can almost guess what part of England you come from." "My folk have been settled in Dorset for almost 200 years, sir. That's my home." "Yes, indeed," said Poirot. "There's one thing I'd like to ask you, Mitchell." This is a very trifling matter. I only wondered if anything on Madame Giselle's table was disarranged. The spoons and forks, the salt cellar, anything like that." The man shook his head. "Everything was cleared away, bar the coffee cup. I didn't notice anything myself. I was much too flustered." "I will," said Poirot. "It is no matter. Sometime I must have a word with your colleague, Davis. Has this business upset him much?" "Oh, well, sir, you see, he's only a young fella. If you ask me, he's almost enjoyed it all." "Has he perhaps a young lady?" asked Poirot. "Doubtless his connection with the crime would be very thrilling to her." "He's courting old Johnson's daughter at the Crown and Feathers," said Mrs. Mitchell. "But she's a sensible girl." Not many hours later, in the bar of the Crown and Feathers, Poirot had a word with the other steward, Davis. He asked Davis the same question he had asked Mitchell. "There was something," said Davis slowly. "I noticed it when I was clearing up after the police had done with the place. It's only that the dead lady had 2 coffee spoons in her saucer. It does sometimes happen when we're serving in a hurry." "Was there a spoon missing from anyone else's saucer?" asked Poirot. "No, sir, not that I noticed." Mr. James Ryder was rather surprised when a card bearing the name of Hercule Poirot was brought to him. "You will forgive my troubling you, I trust," said Poirot. "It is this affair of the death of Madame Giselle." "Yes," said Mr. Ryder. "Well, what about it?" "The inspector was round here a few days ago. Nosy, that's what those fellas are. A man's got his feelings and his business reputation to think about." "You are perhaps a little oversensitive," said Poirot mildly. "I'm in a delicate position, I am," said Mr. Ryder. "Sitting where I did, just in front of her, well, it looks fishy, I suppose. But there was a bright side to the picture. I don't mind telling you, I cleaned up a tidy little sum from the papers. Eyewitness stuff." "It is interesting," said Poirot, "how crime affects the lives of people who are quite outside it. You make suddenly a quite unexpected sum of money, a sum of money, perhaps, particularly welcome at the moment." "Money's always welcome." Mr. Ryder eyed Poirot sharply. "Sometimes the need of it is imperative," said Poirot. "For that reason men embezzle. They make fraudulent entries." He waved his hands. "All sorts of complications arise. This money was grateful to you, since you failed to raise a loan in Paris." "How the devil did you know that?" asked Mr. Ryder angrily. "What was it you wanted to see me about?" "It is a little delicate. It has come to my ears that in spite of your denials, you did have dealings with this woman, Giselle." "Who says so? It's a lie. I never saw this woman." Poirot looked at him thoughtfully and shook his head. "Do not enrage yourself. I must apologize for having been misinformed." And he rose and took his leave. The Countess of Horbury sat in her bedroom at 315 Grosvenor Square in front of her toilet table. Dainty luxury was all around her, but she sat with dry lips and a face on which the rouge showed up in unbecoming patches on her cheeks. She read the letter for the 4th time. The Countess of Horbury. Dear Madam, Ray, Madame Giselle deceased. I am the holder of certain documents formerly in the possession of the deceased lady. If you or Mr. Raymond Barraclough are interested in the matter, I should be happy to call upon you with a view to discussing the affair. Or perhaps you would prefer me to deal with your husband in the matter. Yours truly, John Robinson. The beast! The beast! And that lying old Frenchwoman who had sworn that all arrangements were made to protect clients in case of her own sudden demise. Damn! Life was hell. Hell! "Oh, my God, my nerves," thought Cicely. "It isn't fair. It isn't fair." Her shaking hand went out to a gold-topped bottle. "It will steady me, pull me together." She snuffed the stuff up her nose. There. Now she could think. What to do? She went over to the writing table, dashed off in her big, unformed handwriting. "The Countess of Horbury presents her compliments to Mr. John Robinson, and will see him if he calls at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning." "Well, I do?" asked Norman. "Name of a name," said Hercule Poirot. "What kind of a comedy is it that you are playing?" Norman Gale flushed deeply. He mumbled, "You said a slight disguise would be as well." Poirot sighed. Then he took the young man by the arm and marched him to the looking-glass. "Regard yourself," he said. "That is all I ask of you. Regard yourself. Cheap, false beard, false eyebrows, even false hair. And the spirit gum, one smells it several yards away. What do you think you are? A Santa Claus dressed to amuse children?" "I acted in amateur theatricals a good deal at one time," said Norman Gale stiffly. "I presume they did not let you indulge in your own ideas of make-up," said Poirot. "No, mon ami, you are a blackmailer, not a comedian. I want her ladyship to fear you, not to die of laughing when she sees you. Take this, and this." He pressed various jars upon Norman. "Go into the bathroom, and let us have an end of what you call in this country the fool-tommery." Crushed, Norman Gale obeyed. When he emerged a quarter of an hour later, Poirot gave him a nod of approval. "Très bien. The fuss is over. Now, let me see if you at least know your lines." He listened with attention, then nodded. "That is good. En avant, and good luck to you." With his spirits at zero, Norman Gale departed on his distasteful mission. At Grosvenor Square, he was shown into a small room on the first floor where Lady Horbury sat. "Mr. Robinson?" said Cicely. Norman braced himself. "At your service," he said, and bowed. "I had your letter," said Cicely. Norman said, rather insolently, "Quite so. Well, what about it, Lady Horbury?" "I don't know what you mean." Come. Must we really go into details? Everyone knows how pleasant well, call it a weekend at the seaside can be, but husbands seldom agree. Wonderful woman, old Giselle. Always had the goods. Hotel evidence, etc., is quite first class. Now, the question is, who wants it most, you or Lord Horbury?" She stood there shivering. "I'm a seller," said Norman, his voice growing commoner as he threw himself more wholeheartedly into the part of Mr. Robinson. "Are you a buyer? That's the question." "Show me the evidence," said Cicely. "Oh, no." Norman shook his head with a cunning leer. "I didn't bring anything with me. If we agree to do business, that's another matter." How much?" 10,000 of the best. Pounds, not dollars." "Impossible. I could never lay my hands on anything like that amount." "Look here. To oblige a lady, I'll make it 8,000. That's my last word." "I can't get the money, I tell you." Norman sighed and shook his head. "Well, perhaps it's only right that Lord Horbury should know what's been going on. I believe I'm correct in saying that a divorced woman gets no alimony, and Mr. Barraclough's a very promising young actor, but he's not touching big money. Now, I'll leave you to think it over." "Ouch," said Norman as he reached the street. "Thank goodness that's over." It was a bare hour later when a card was brought to Lady Horbury. "Monsieur Hercule Poirot." She thrust it aside. "Who is he? I can't see him." "He said, my lady, that he was here at the request of Mr. Raymond Barraclough." "Oh." She paused. "Very well. Show him in." Exquisitely dressed in the most dandified style, Monsieur Poirot entered, bowed. The butler closed the door. Cicely took a step forward. "Mr. Barraclough sent you?" "Sit down, madame." His tone was kindly but authoritative. "Écoutez, madame, I do not ask you to give away your secrets. I know them beforehand. That is the essence of being a good detective." "A detective?" Her eyes widened. "I remember. You were on the plane. It was you." "Precisely. It was me. Now, madame, let us get to business. This morning, not an hour ago, you had a visitor. That visitor, his name was Brown, perhaps?" "Robinson," said Cicely faintly. "It is the same thing. Brown, Smith, or Robinson, he uses them in turn. He came here to blackmail you, madame. He has in his possession certain proofs of, shall we say, indiscretion. Those proofs were once in the keeping of Madame Giselle. Now, this man has them. He offers them to you for perhaps £7,000? 8. And you, madame, will not find it easy to get that sum very quickly." "I can't do it. I simply can't do it. I'm in debt already. I don't know what to do." "Calm yourself, madame. I will deal with this Mr. Robinson." "How much will you want?" said Cicely sharply. "I shall ask only a photograph, signed, of a very beautiful lady. Only, madame, I must have the truth. The whole truth. Do not keep anything back, or my hands will be tied." "All right. I'll tell you everything." "Good. Now then, you borrowed money from this woman, Giselle." Lady Horbury nodded. "When did it begin?" "About 18 months ago. I had an appalling run of luck. Raymond, Mr. Barraclough, told me that he had heard she lent money to society women." "I gather," said Poirot, "that before then you and Mr. Barraclough had become, friends? You were anxious your husband should not know?" Cicely cried angrily. "Stephen's a prig. He's tired of me. He wants to marry someone else. He'd have jumped at the thought of divorcing me." "And you did not want divorce?" "No, I... You liked your position, and you also enjoyed the use of a very ample income." Poirot nodded. To proceed, there arose the question of repayment. I couldn't pay back the money. And then the old devil turned nasty. She knew all about me and Raymond. She'd found out places and dates and everything. I can't think how." "So, her death was quite providential?" Cicely drew in her breath sharply. "Especially," Poirot continued, "since you had been to see her in Paris the night before, and had had something of a scene with her, and yet you said at the inquest that you had never seen the woman before." "It's been too ghastly," Cicely cried. "Nothing but lies, lies. But I felt safe, till that awful letter yesterday." "You have not been afraid," said Poirot, "of exposure, or of being arrested for murder?" The colour ebbed from Cicely Horbury's cheeks. "Oh, you don't believe that? I didn't kill her. I never moved from my seat." Hercule Poirot said soothingly, "I believe you, madame, for 2 reasons. First, because of your sex, and secondly, because of a wasp." She stared at him. "A wasp?" "Exactly. That does not make sense to you, I see. Now then, let us attend to the matter in hand. I will deal with this Mr. Robinson. I pledge my word you will never see or hear of him again. Now, in return, I will ask 2 little questions. Was Mr. Barraclough in Paris the day before the murder?" "Yes, we dined together." "Secondly, Your stage name, before you were married, was Cicely Bland. Was that your real name, and where were you born? My real name is Martha Jebb, said Cicely. I was born in Doncaster. But why? Mere curiosity, said Poirot. Detective Inspector Japp was shown into a waiting room. Two women in the waiting room were talking. They obviously had a very high opinion of Dr. Bryant's abilities. More patients came in. Evidently Dr. Bryant was doing well in his profession. Doesn't look like he needed to borrow, thought Japp to himself. But of course the loan may have taken place a long time ago. Anyway, he's got a fine practice. A breath of scandal would burst it to bits. A quarter of an hour later, the butler said, "The doctor will see you now, sir." Japp was shown into Dr. Bryant's consulting room. The doctor was sitting at his desk. His fine-lined face showed fatigue, but he seemed in no way disturbed by the inspector's visit. "What can I do for you, Inspector?" he said, as he motioned Japp to a chair opposite. "I suppose this is about the aeroplane death?" "Quite right, sir. We're not as far on as we'd like to be. As far as I can make out, Doctor, there's a medical side to this snake venom business. Is it true that it is sometimes injected for epilepsy?" "I believe," said Dr. Bryant, "that injections of cobra venom have been used in the treatment of epilepsy with excellent results. I thought it possible that you'd have some ideas on the subject yourself that might be useful to me. It's not much good my going to an expert if I don't know what to ask him." Dr. Bryant smiled. "There is something in what you say, Inspector. I admit I have speculated a good deal about the case in my quiet way. And what do you think, sir?" Bryant shook his head slowly. "It amazes me. The whole thing seems almost unreal. It seems a chance in 100 that the murderer was not seen. And the choice of poison is equally amazing. How could a would-be murderer possibly get hold of such a thing?" "I agree," said Japp. "It seems incredible." "You yourself, sir, now, you're a doctor, but I don't suppose you've ever handled the stuff." "There are certainly not many opportunities of doing so. I have a friend who works at tropical research. In his laboratory there are various specimens of dried snake venoms, that of the cobra, for instance, but I cannot remember any specimen of the boomslang." When Japp emerged into Harley Street, he was smiling. On his arrival at Scotland Yard, he was told that Monsieur Hercule Poirot was waiting to see him. "Well, Monsieur Poirot, any news?" "I came to ask you for news," said Poirot. "Well, there isn't much, and that's the truth. The dealer fellow in Paris has identified the blowpipe all right. Fournier's been worrying the life out of me from Paris about his moment psychologique. I've questioned the passengers, too. Clancy's got something on his mind, but I can't get a line on motive. I still think CL52 in the Black Book is Lady Horbury, but I can't get anything out of her." Poirot smiled to himself. "The stewards. Well, I can't find a thing to connect them to Giselle." "And Dr. Bryant?" asked Poirot. "I think I'm onto something there. Rumours about him and a patient. Pretty woman, nasty husband. Takes drugs or something. If Bryant's not careful, he'll be struck off the medical council. That fits in with RT362 well enough. And I don't mind telling you that I've got a pretty shrewd idea where he could have got the snake venom from. I went to see him, and he gave himself away rather badly over that. Still, so far it is all surmise. No facts. Ryder seems all square and above board. The whole thing is a muddle. Fournier's stumped too. I suppose you've got it all taped out, but you'd rather not tell." "I have not got it all taped out. I proceed a step at a time, with order and method, but there is still far to go." Poirot smiled and took a paper from his pocket. "My idea is this. An action is performed, the action being murder. What now are the results of that action? Eh bien, I study today, 3 weeks after the crime, the result in 11 different cases." He spread out the paper. Japp leaned forward with some interest and read over Poirot's shoulder. "Miss Gray. Result, temporary improvement, increased salary. Mr. Gale. Result, bad, loss of practice. Lady Horbury. Result, good if she is CL52. Miss Carr. Result, bad, since Giselle's death makes it more unlikely Lord Horbury will get the evidence to divorce his wife. Mr. Clancy. Result, good, expects to make money by book dealing with the murder. Dr. Bryant. Result, good if RT362. Mr. Ryder. Result, good, owing to small amount of cash obtained through articles on murder which tided firm over delicate times. Also good if Ryder is XVB724. Monsieur Dupont. Result, unaffected. Monsieur Jean Dupont. Result, the same. Mitchell. Result, unaffected. Davis. Result, unaffected. It gives one a clear classification, explained Poirot. In 4 cases, Mr. Clancy, Miss Gray, Mr. Ryder, and I think I may say Lady Horbury, there is a result on the credit side. In 4 cases, there is no result at all, so far as we know. And in 1, Dr. Bryant, there is either no result or a distinct gain. And so, asked Japp. And so we must go on seeking, said Poirot. The most interesting thing about this case is the personality of the dead woman. Do you think there is a clue in her past? Perhaps. Well, let's hear your ideas of the clues in the case. Poirot smiled. I will give them titles, like the names of Mr. Clancy's stories. The clue of the wasp. The clue in the passenger's baggage. The clue of the extra coffee spoon. When Norman Gale, Jane, and Poirot met for dinner on the night following the blackmailing incident, Norman was relieved to hear that his services as Mr. Robinson were no longer required. What happened? Asked Jane. Poirot smiled at her. I found out what I wanted to know. Was she mixed up with Giselle? Yes. Jane and Norman both looked at him inquiringly, but Poirot, in a provoking manner, began to discuss the relationship between a career and life. There are not so many round pegs in square holes as one might think. Most people, in spite of what they tell you, choose the occupations that they secretly desire. I don't agree with you, said Gale. I'm a dentist by chance, not choice. My uncle was a dentist. He wanted me to come in with him, but I was all for adventure and seeing the world. I chucked dentistry and went off to farm in South Africa. However, that wasn't much good. I hadn't got enough experience. I had to accept the old man's offer and come and set up business with him. And now you are thinking of chucking dentistry again and going off to Canada? This time, I shall be forced to do it. Nothing's forcing me to travel, said Jane wistfully. I wish it would. Eh bien, I make you an offer here and now. I go to Paris next week. If you like, you can take the job of my secretary. I will give you a good salary. Jane shook her head. I mustn't give up Antoine's. It's a good job. Poirot looked at her and smiled enigmatically. 3 days later, he was rung up. Monsieur Poirot, said Jane, is that job still open? I had a row with Antoine. As a matter of fact, I lost my temper with a customer, so here I am, thrown out on my ear. On their way by train from Calais to Paris, Poirot gave Jane some idea of his plans. There are several people in Paris that I have to see. There is the lawyer, Maître Thibault. There is also Monsieur Fournier of the Sûreté, and there are Monsieur Dupont père and Monsieur Dupont fils. Now, Mademoiselle Jane, whilst I am taking on the father, I shall leave the son to you. I fancy Monsieur Dupont will remember you from the inquest. I've seen him since then, said Jane, her colour rising slightly. Indeed? How was that? Jane described their meeting in the corner house. Excellent. It was a famous idea of mine to bring you to Paris with me. Now, listen, Mademoiselle Jane. It might be as well if, without actually saying so, you could convey the impression that Lady Horbury is suspected of the crime. Jane hesitated for a minute, then said, You don't suspect young Monsieur Dupont of the crime, do you? He attracts you, eh, this young man? No. I desire information merely. I have the feeling very strongly, mademoiselle, that there is a figure who has not yet come into the limelight. A part, as yet, unplayed. 2 days after their arrival in Paris, Monsieur Hercule Poirot and his secretary dined in a small restaurant, and the two Dupont, father and son, were Poirot's guests. Old Monsieur Dupont Jane found as charming as his son, but she got little chance of talking to him. Poirot monopolized him severely from the start. His interest in archaeological research in Persia seemed both deep and sincere. Jane found Jean Dupont no less easy to get on with than she had done in London. His attractive, boyish personality pleased her now as it had then. Whose suggestion it was that the two young people should go to a cinema was not quite clear, but when they had gone, Poirot drew his chair a little closer to the table and seemed prepared to take a still more practical interest in archaeological research. Naturally, he said, it is a great anxiety in these difficult financial days to raise sufficient funds. You accept private donations? Monsieur Dupont laughed. My dear friend, we sue for them practically on bended knees, but our particular type of dig does not attract the great mass of humanity. It is amazing how little the average person cares for pottery. Would a donation, for instance, of £500? You are offering that? But it is magnificent, stupendous. Poirot coughed. I will admit, a favour. Ah, yes, a souvenir, some specimens of pottery. No, you misunderstand me. It is my secretary, that charming girl you saw tonight, Mademoiselle Gray. She is passionately interested in pottery. If she could accompany you on your next expedition— Monsieur Dupont seemed slightly taken aback for a moment. Well, he said, pulling his moustache, it might possibly be arranged. I will speak to Jean. Poirot reached his hotel to find Jane saying good night to Jean Dupont in the hall. As they went up in the lift, Poirot said, I have obtained for you a job of great interest. You are to accompany the Dupont to Persia in the spring. Jane stared at him. Are you quite mad? I am certainly not going to Persia. I shall be in Muswell Hill, or in Canada with Norman. Poirot twinkled at her gently. At 10:30 on the following morning, Monsieur Fournier walked into Poirot's sitting-room and shook the little Belgian by the hand. Monsieur, he said, there is something I want to tell you. I have, I think, at last seen the point of what you said in London about the finding of the blowpipe. Ah! Poirot's face lighted up. Yes, said Fournier, taking a chair. That day in London you said, why was the blowpipe found when it might so easily have been passed out through the ventilator? And I think now that I have the answer. The blowpipe was found because the murderer wanted it to be found, because the blowpipe was not used. Bravo, said Poirot. I say to myself, continued Fournier, the poison dart, yes, but not the blowpipe. Then something else was used to send that dart through the air, and I remembered your insistence on a complete list of all that was found in the passengers' luggage and upon their persons. There were two things that especially attracted my attention. Lady Horbury had 2 cigarette holders, and on the table in front of the Dupont were a number of Kurdish pipes. Poirot hesitated, then he said, "You are on the right track, yes, but go a little further, and do not forget the wasp. It is there that—" He broke off as the telephone rang. "Hello, hello? Ah, Maître Thibault. Monsieur Fournier, yes, he is here." Fournier took the telephone. "Yes, it is Fournier speaking." "What?" "Yes, indeed." He replaced the receiver and looked across at Poirot. "It is the daughter of Madame Giselle. She has arrived to claim her heritage." "This, my friend," said Poirot, rising, "is what I have been waiting for, the entry on the scene of the shadowy figure of whose presence I have been conscious all along." Maître Thibault received Poirot and Fournier with great affability. "I received a letter yesterday," he said, "and this morning the young lady herself called upon me." "What age is Mademoiselle Morisot?" asked Poirot. "Mademoiselle Morisot, or rather Mrs. Richards, for she is married, is exactly 24 years of age." "She brought documents to prove her identity?" asked Fournier. "Certainly, certainly," said the lawyer. "To begin with, there is this." It was a copy of a marriage certificate between George Lehman, bachelor, and Marie Morisot, both of Quebec. Its date was 1910. There was also the birth certificate of Anne Morisot Lehman. "This throws a certain light on the early life of Madame Giselle," said Fournier. Thibault nodded. "As far as I can piece it out," he said, "Marie Morisot was a nursery governess or sewing maid when she met this man Lehman. He was, I gather, a bad lot, who deserted her soon after the marriage, and she resumed her maiden name. The child was received in the Institut de Marie at Quebec, and was brought up there. Marie Morisot, or Lehman, left Quebec shortly afterwards and came to France. She remitted sums of money from time to time, and finally dispatched a lump sum of ready money to be given to the child on attaining the age of 21. At that time, Marie Morisot considered it better to sunder any personal relations." "How did the girl realize that she was heiress to a fortune?" asked Fournier. "We have inserted discreet advertisements in various newspapers. It seems one of these came to the notice of the principal of the Institut de Marie, and she wrote or telegraphed to Mrs. Richards, who was then in Europe, but on the point of returning to the States." "Who is Richards?" asked Poirot. "I gather he is an American or Canadian from Detroit, by profession a maker of surgical instruments. He is still in America." "Is Mrs. Richards able to throw any light upon the possible reason for her mother's murder?" said Fournier. The lawyer shook his head. "She knows nothing about her. In fact, she didn't even remember what her mother's maiden name was." "It looks," said Fournier, "as though her appearance on the scene is not going to be of any help in solving the murder problem. I am on quite another track at present. My inquiries have narrowed down to a choice of 3 persons." "4," said Poirot. "The 2 cigarette holders, the Kurdish pipes, and a flute. Remember, the flute, my friend." At that moment the door opened, and an aged clerk mumbled, "The lady has returned." "Ah," said Thibault, "come in, madame. Let me present to you Monsieur Fournier of the Sûreté and Monsieur Hercule Poirot. Madame Richards." Giselle's daughter was a dark, chic-looking young woman. She was very smartly, though plainly dressed. In answer to Fournier's questions, she spoke warmly and gratefully of Mère Angélique, the head of the Institut de Marie. "You left the Institut when, madame?" "When I was 18, monsieur. I started to earn my own living. I was, for a time, a manicurist. I have also been in a dressmaker's establishment. I met my husband in Nice. He was just returning to the States. He came over again on business to Holland, and we were married in Rotterdam a month ago. Unfortunately, he had to return to Canada. I was detained, but I am now about to rejoin him." They talked a little further, but it seemed clear that Mrs. Richards could be of little assistance to them in their search for the murderer. She knew nothing at all of her mother's life or business relations. Having elicited the name of the hotel at which she was staying, Poirot and Fournier took leave of her. Poirot shook his head in a discouraged manner. "I do not think she is an impostor. It is odd, though. I feel that I have either seen her before, or that she reminds me of someone." Fournier looked at him curiously. "You have always, I think, been intrigued by the missing daughter." "Naturally," said Poirot, his eyebrows rising a little. "Of all the people who may or may not benefit by Giselle's death, a very large fortune passes to this girl. Do you wonder that from the beginning I speculate as to her being implicated?" Poirot and Fournier left the lawyer's office and returned to the hotel where Poirot was staying. An object lying on the reception desk caught Fournier's eye. "It was unpardonable of me," he said, "to have forgotten Dr. Bryant's fruit." He stopped as the man standing at the reception desk turned, his hand on the flute case. His face lit up in grave recognition. "Monsieur Poirot." "Dr. Bryant," said Poirot, bowing. They shook hands as Fournier discreetly withdrew. A woman who had been standing near Bryant moved away towards the lift. "Well, Monsieur le Docteur, are your patients managing to do without you for a little?" "I have no patients now," said Dr. Bryant. "I have retired." He looked tired, but strangely peaceful. "It was a necessary decision before I am struck off the register. There is a lady, a patient of mine. I love her very dearly. She has a husband who causes her infinite misery. Now she and I are on our way to Kenya to begin a new life." He spoke in a brisker tone. "I tell you this, Monsieur Poirot, because soon it will be public property, and the sooner you know, the better." "I understand," said Poirot. "My best wishes for your future, and for that of Madame." When Fournier rejoined him, Poirot was making arrangements for a long-distance call to Quebec. "What now?" cried Fournier. "You are still preoccupied with this girl who inherits?" "Not at all," said Poirot. "But one must finish with one thing before proceeding to the next. Here is Mademoiselle Jane. Suppose you both commence déjeuner. I will join you as soon as I can." Fournier acquiesced, and he and Jane went into the dining room. He was just explaining some of the circumstances of Anne Morisot's life when Poirot rejoined them. He looked a little dejected. "I spoke to the principal, Mère Angélique herself. She confirmed exactly what Mrs. Richards told us of her circumstances. Money was sent regularly, but Giselle never suggested a meeting. Anne Morisot left the Institut 6 years ago to become a manicurist. Afterwards, she had a job as a lady's maid, and finally left Quebec for Europe in that capacity." "What about the husband?" asked Fournier. "Now that we know definitely that Giselle was married, the husband might become a factor?" "That was one of the reasons for my telephone call," Poirot replied. "Georges Lehmann, Giselle's blackguard of a husband, was killed in the early days of the war." He paused, and then remarked abruptly, "What was it that I have just said? Not my last remark, the one before. I have an idea that, without knowing it, I said something of significance." Fournier repeated as well as he could the substance of Poirot's remarks, but the little man shook his head in a dissatisfied manner. He suggested that they have coffee in the lounge. Jane agreed, and stretched out her hand for her bag, which was on the table. As she picked it up, she winced. "What is it, mademoiselle?" "Oh, it's nothing. It's only a jagged nail. I must file it." Poirot sat down again very suddenly. "Nom de nom," he said quietly. "I remember now why the face of Anne Morisot is familiar to me. I have seen her before. In the aeroplane, on the day of the murder. Lady Horbury sent for her to get a nail file. Anne Morisot was Lady Horbury's maid. This sudden revelation had an almost stunning effect on the three people sitting round the luncheon table. "I remember," said Jane, "a tall, dark girl. Madeline, Lady Horbury called her." Poirot made a frantic gesture with his hands. "That is it," he said. "Madeline." "The motive," said Fournier, "and the opportunity. Yes, it is all there. But why did no one mention this before?" "I have told you, my friend, I have told you," said Poirot wearily. "My unfortunate stomach." Yes, that is understandable, but there were other stomachs unaffected. The stewards, the other passengers. "I think," said Jane, "that perhaps it was because it was so very early this happened. The plane had only just left Le Bourget, and Giselle was alive and well an hour or so after that. Can there have been a delayed action of the poison? Such things happen," said Fournier thoughtfully. Poirot groaned and dropped his head into his hands. I must think. Can it be possible that all along my ideas have been wrong, completely wrong? That all along I have attached too much importance to one particular thing? I expected to find a certain clue. I found it, and I built up my case from it. But if I have been wrong from the beginning—" His voice tailed off. "For the moment," said Fournier, "it would, I think, be unwise to arouse Anne Morisot's suspicions. We know the hotel at which she is staying, and we can keep in touch with her through Thibault. We have 2 points established: opportunity and motive. We have still to prove that Anne Morisot had snake venom in her possession. There is also the question of the American who bought the blowpipe and bribed Jules Perrault at Universal Airlines. It might certainly be the husband, Richards. We have only her word for it that he is in Canada. As you say, the husband. Yes, the husband. Ah, wait. Poirot pressed his hands upon his temples. It is all wrong. I do not employ the little grey cells of the brain in an orderly and methodical way. Let us reason. Why, if Anne Morisot is innocent, has she concealed the fact that she was lady's maid to Lady Horbury? Why, indeed, said Fournier. So, we say, Poirot continued, that Anne Morisot is guilty because she lied. Suppose my first supposition was correct. Will that supposition fit in with Anne Morisot's guilt or with Anne Morisot's lie? Yes, it might, given one premise. But if that premise is correct, then Anne Morisot should not have been on the plane at all. Suddenly Poirot drew in his breath with a hiss. Of course, he said. It is a possibility, and it ought to be very simple to find out. He rose. What now, my friend? Asked Fournier. Again the telephone, said Poirot. It took some little time to put the call through, but Poirot's luck was in. Lady Horbury was lunching at home. When he replaced the receiver and turned to Fournier, his eyes were green and shining. Listen, my friend. Lady Horbury's maid, who has recently left her, usually travelled by train and boat. On the occasion of Giselle's murder, Lady Horbury decided at the last moment that Madeleine had better go by air too. He took the Frenchman by the arm. Quick, my friend, he said. We must go to our hotel. There is no time to be lost. Fournier hastened after him. Why this mad rush, this haste? Because, my friend, said Poirot, if my little idea is correct, Anne Morisot is in imminent danger. The taxi drew up with a jerk at the quiet hotel where Anne Morisot was staying. Poirot sprang out. He went up to the reception desk. You have a Mrs. Richards staying here, I believe, said Poirot. No, monsieur, she was staying here, but she left a little over half an hour ago. Where has she gone? The clerk stiffened at the questions. Fournier produced his credentials. The clerk changed his tone. No, the lady had not left an address. He thought her departure was the result of a sudden change of plan. A gentleman had called to see the lady, and they had lunched together. He was an American gentleman, very American. She had seemed surprised to see him. After lunch, she had given orders for her luggage to be brought down and put on a taxi. She had driven to the Gare du Nord, at least that is the order she had given to the taximan. She had gone alone. "That means the train to England on the face of it," said Fournier. "We must telephone to Boulogne." The Frenchman's face was anxious. It was 5 o'clock when Jane, sitting in the lounge of the hotel with a book, looked up to see Poirot coming towards her. "What has happened?" she said. "When the boat train reached Boulogne, they found a woman in a first-class carriage, dead. Anne Morisseau. In her hand was a little blue glass bottle which contained hydrocyanic acid." "Suicide?" said Jane. Poirot did not answer for a moment or two. He slowly spread out his hands in an expressive gesture. He said carefully, "Yes, the police think it was suicide." The next day, Poirot left Paris. Jane stayed behind with a list of duties to perform. Most of these seemed singularly meaningless to her, but she carried them out to the best of her powers. She saw Jean Dupont twice. He mentioned the expedition which she was to join. She hedged as best she could. 5 days later, she was recalled to England by a telegram. Norman met her at Victoria, and they discussed recent events. Very little publicity had been given to the suicide. There had been a paragraph in the paper stating that a Canadian lady, a Mrs. Richards, had committed suicide in the Paris-Boulogne Express, but that was all. Norman was not so sanguine as Jane. "They may suspect her of doing her mother in, but now she's taken this way out, they probably won't bother to go on with the case. From the point of view of the public, we shall remain under suspicion just as much as ever." He said as much to Poirot, whom he met a few days later in Piccadilly. Poirot smiled. "You think I am an old man who accomplishes nothing. Listen, you shall come tonight to dine with me. Jap is coming, and also our friend Mr. Clancy. I have some things to say that may be interesting." The dinner passed off pleasantly, and when coffee had been drunk, Poirot cleared his throat in a slightly embarrassed manner, not free from self-importance. "My friends," he said, "I propose, if it will not bore you all, to give you a little resume of my methods in dealing with this case." 3 politely interested faces were turned to him, and he began, "I will start at the beginning, my friends. I will go back to the airliner Prometheus when, just before we reached Croydon, Dr. Bryant was approached by the steward and went with him to examine the body. I accompanied him. I had a feeling it might, who knows, be something in my line. Dr. Bryant confirmed the steward's fear that the woman was dead. It was at this point that a suggestion was made by Monsieur Jean Dupont that death was due to shock following on a wasp sting. He drew attention to a wasp that he himself had slaughtered shortly before. Now, that was a perfectly plausible theory. There was the mark on the dead woman's neck closely resembling the mark of a sting. But at that moment I was fortunate enough to look down and espy what might at first have been taken for the body of yet another wasp. In actuality, it was a native fawn with a little teased yellow and black silk on it. At this point, Mr. Clancy came forward and made the statement that it was a thorn shot from a blowpipe. Later, as you all know, the blowpipe itself was discovered. By the time we reached Croydon, my brain began to work once more with its normal brilliance. "Go to it, Monsieur Poirot," said Japp with a grin. No false modesty." Poirot threw him a look, and went on. "One idea presented itself very strongly to me, and that was the audacity of a crime being committed in such a manner, and the astonishing fact that nobody noticed its being done. There were two other points that interested me. One was the convenient presence of the wasp. The other was the discovery of the blowpipe. As I remarked after the inquest to my friend Japp, why on earth did the murderer not get rid of it by passing it through the ventilating hole in the window? Obviously, the murderer wanted the blowpipe to be found. But why? Only one answer seemed logical. In reality, the murder had not been committed that way. On the other hand, as medical evidence was to show, the cause of death was, undoubtedly, the poison dart. I shut my eyes and asked myself, what is the surest and most reliable way of placing a poisoned thorn in the jugular vein? And the answer came immediately. By hand. If my theory was right, the person who killed Madame Giselle was a person who went right up to her table and bent over her. Was there such a person? Yes, there were two people, the two stewards. Was there anyone else? Well, there was Mr. Clancy. He was the only person in the car who passed immediately by Madame Giselle's seat. Mr. Clancy sprang to his feet. "I protest, this is an outrage," he cried. "Sit down," said Poirot. "I have not yet finished." So, I had now 3 persons as possible suspects: Mitchell, Davis, and Mr. Clancy. I next turned my mind to the possibilities of the wasp. No one had noticed it until about the time coffee was served. That in itself was rather curious. I constructed a certain theory of the crime. The murderer presented to the world 2 separate solutions of the tragedy. On the first, or simplest, Madame Giselle was stung by a wasp and had succumbed to heart failure. The success of that solution depended on whether or not the murderer was in a position to retrieve the thorn. There was the particular coloring of silk, which I had no doubt was to simulate the appearance of a wasp. Our murderer, then, approaches the victim's table, inserts the thorn, and releases the wasp. The poison is so powerful that death would occur almost immediately. That, as I say, was plan number 1. But supposing that, as actually happened, the poisoned thorn was discovered before the murderer could retrieve it. The theory of natural death is impossible. Instead of getting rid of the blowpipe through the window, it is put in a place where it is bound to be discovered. When the blowpipe is traced, it will focus suspicion in a definite and prearranged direction. I had now my theory of the crime, and I had 3 suspects, with a barely possible 4th, Monsieur Jean Dupont, who had outlined the death by wasp sting theory, and who was sitting just on the gangway so near Giselle that he might just possibly have moved from it without being noticed. I concentrated on the problem of the wasp. If the murderer had brought the wasp onto the plane and released it at the psychological moment, he must have had something in the nature of a small box in which to keep it. Hence my interest in the contents of the passenger's pockets and hand luggage. And there I came up against a totally unexpected development. I found what I was looking for, but, as it seemed to me, on the wrong person. There was an empty, small-sized Bryant and May matchbox in Mr. Norman Gale's pocket. But, by everybody's evidence, Mr. Gale had never passed down the gangway of the car. he had visited the toilet compartment and returned to his own seat. Nevertheless, although it seems impossible, there was a method by which Mr. Gale could have committed the crime, as the content of his attaché case showed. "My attaché case?" said Norman Gale. He looked amused and puzzled. "Why, I don't even remember now what was in it." Poirot smiled at him amiably. "Wait a little minute. I am telling you my first ideas. To proceed, I had 4 persons who could have done the crime from the point of view of possibility: the 2 stewards, Clancy, and Gale. I now looked at the case from the opposite angle, that of motive. If a motive were to coincide with a possibility, well, I had my murderer. But, alas, I could find nothing of the kind. To whose benefit would it be if Madame Giselle were removed? Clearly to our unknown daughter's benefit. There were also certain persons who might be in Madame Giselle's power. Of the passengers on the plane, I could only be certain of one who was undoubtedly mixed up with Giselle. That one was Lady Horbury. In Lady Horbury's case, the motive was very clear. She had visited Giselle at her house in Paris the night before. She was desperate, and she had a friend, a young actor, who might easily have impersonated the American who bought the blowpipe, and might also have bribed the clerk in Universal Airlines to ensure that Giselle traveled by the 12 o'clock service. I had, as it were, a problem in 2 halves. I did not see how it was possible for Lady Horbury to commit the crime, and I could not see for what motive the stewards, Mr. Clancy, or Mr. Gale should want to commit it. Always in the back of my mind, I considered the problem of Giselle's unknown daughter and heiress. Were any of my 4 suspects married? And if so, could one of the wives be this Anne Morisot? If her father was English, the girl might have been brought up in England. Mitchell's wife I soon dismissed. She was of good old Dorset stock. Davis was courting a girl whose father and mother were alive. Mr. Clancy was not married. Mr. Gale was obviously head over heels in love with Miss Jane Grey. I may say that I investigated the antecedents of Miss Grey very carefully, having learned from her in casual conversation that she had been brought up in an orphanage near Dublin. But I soon satisfied myself that Miss Grey was not Madame Giselle's daughter. I made out a table of results. The stewards had neither gained nor lost by Madame Giselle's death. Mr. Clancy was planning a book on the subject by which he hoped to make money. Mr. Gale was fast losing his practice. Nothing very helpful there. And yet, at that time, I was convinced that Mr. Gale was the murderer. There was the empty matchbox, the contents of his attaché case. Apparently he lost, not gained, by the death of Giselle, but those appearances might be false appearances. Now, it is my experience that no one, in the course of conversation, can fail to give themselves away, sooner or later. I tried to gain Mr. Gale's confidence. I pretended to confide in him, and I even enlisted his help. I persuaded him to aid me in the fake blackmailing of Lady Horbury, and it was then that he made his first mistake. I had suggested a slight disguise. He arrived to play his part with a ridiculous outfit. No one, I felt sure, could play a part as badly as he was proposing, unless his knowledge of his own guilt made him wary of showing himself to be a good actor. When, however, I had adjusted his ridiculous makeup, his artistic skill showed itself. He played his part perfectly, and Lady Horbury did not recognize him. I was convinced then that he could have disguised himself as an American in Paris, and could also have played the necessary part in the Prometheus. By this time, I was getting seriously worried about Mademoiselle Jane. With the object of preventing a precipitate marriage, I took Mademoiselle Jane to Paris as my secretary. It was whilst we were there that the missing heiress appeared to claim her fortune. I was haunted by a resemblance that I could not place. I did place it in the end, but too late. At first, the discovery that she had actually been in the plane and had lied about it seemed to overthrow all my theories. Here, overwhelmingly, was the guilty person. But if she were guilty, she had an accomplice, the man who bought the blowpipe and bribed Hercule Poirot. Who was that man? Was it conceivably her husband? And then, suddenly, I saw the true solution. True, that is, if one point could be verified. For my solution to be correct, Anne Morisot ought not to have been on that plane. I rang up Lady Horbury and got my answer. The maid, Madeleine, travelled in the plane by a last-minute whim of her mistress. He stopped. "When did you stop pitching on me as the murderer?" asked Norman. Poirot wheeled round on him. "I never stopped. You are the murderer. Wait, I will tell you everything. For the last week, Jap and I have been busy. It is true that you became a dentist to please your uncle, John Gale. You took his name when you came into partnership with him, but you were his sister's son. Your real name is Richards. It was as Richards that you met Anne Morisot at Nice last winter when she was there with her mistress. The story she told us was true as to the facts of her childhood, but the latter part was edited carefully by you. She did know her mother's maiden name. Giselle was at Monte Carlo. She was pointed out, and her real name was mentioned. You realized that there might be a large fortune to be got. It appealed to your gambler's nature. It was from Anne Morisot that you learnt of Lady Horbury's connection with Giselle. The plan of the crime formed itself. Giselle was to be murdered in such a way that suspicion would fall on Lady Horbury. Your plans matured and finally fructified. You bribed the clerk in Universal Airlines so that Giselle should travel on the same plane as Lady Horbury. Anne Morisot had told you that she herself was going to England by train. You never expected her to be on the plane, and it seriously jeopardized your plans. If it was once known that Giselle's daughter and heiress had been on the plane, suspicion would naturally have fallen upon her. Your original idea was that she should claim the inheritance with a perfect alibi, since she would have been on a train or boat at the time of the crime, and then you would have married her. The girl was by this time infatuated with you, but it was money you were after, not the girl herself. There was another complication to your plans. At Le Pinet you saw Mademoiselle Jane Grey, and fell madly in love with her. Your passion for her drove you on to play a much more dangerous game. You intended to have both the money and the girl you loved. You frightened Anne Morisot by telling her that if she came forward at once to proclaim her identity, she would certainly be suspected of the murder. Instead, you induced her to ask for a few days' leave, and you went together to Rotterdam, where you were married. In due course, you primed her on how to claim the money. She was to say nothing of her employment as lady's maid, and it was very clearly to be made plain that she and her husband had been abroad at the time of the murder. Unfortunately, The date planned for Anne Morisot to go to Paris and claim her inheritance coincided with my arrival in Paris, where Miss Grey had accompanied me. That did not suit your book at all. Either Mademoiselle Jane or myself might recognize in Anne Morisot the Madeleine who had been Lady Roberry's maid. You tried to get in touch with her in time, but failed. You finally arrived in Paris yourself and found she had already gone to the lawyer. When she returned, she told you of her meeting with me. Things were becoming dangerous, and you made up your mind to act quickly. It had been your intention that your new-made wife should not survive her accession to wealth very long. Immediately after the marriage ceremony, you had both made wills, leaving all you had, one to the other. You intended, I fancy, to follow a fairly leisurely course. You would have gone to Canada, ostensibly because of the failure of your practice. There you would have resumed the name of Richards, and your wife would have rejoined you. All the same, I do not fancy it would have been very long before Mrs. Richards regrettably died, leaving a fortune to a seemingly inconsolable widower. You would then have returned to England as Norman Gale, having had the good fortune to make a lucky speculation in Canada. Poirot paused, and Norman Gale threw back his head and laughed. You are very clever at knowing what people intend to do. You ought to adopt Mr. Clancy's profession. His tone deepened to one of anger. I never heard such a farrago of nonsense. What you imagined, Monsieur Poirot, is hardly evidence. Poirot did not seem put out. Perhaps not, but then I have some evidence. Really? Sneered Norman. Perhaps you have evidence as to how I killed Giselle, when everyone in the aeroplane knows perfectly well I never went near her. I will tell you exactly how you committed the crime, said Poirot. What about the contents of your dispatch case? You were on a holiday. Why take a dentist's linen coat? And the answer is this, because it resembled so closely a steward's coat. When coffee was served, and the stewards had gone to the other compartment, you went to the toilet, put on your linen coat, padded your cheeks with cotton wool rolls, came out, hurried down the gangway with the steward's quick run, spoon in hand, to Giselle's table. You thrust the thorn into her neck, hurried back to the toilet, changed your coat, and emerged, leisurely, to return to your table. The whole thing took only a couple of minutes. Nobody notices a steward, particularly. The only person who might have recognized you was Mademoiselle Jane. But, left alone, she seizes the opportunity to powder her nose and adjust her makeup. Really, sneered Gale. A most interesting theory. But it didn't happen. Anything else? Quite a lot, said Poirot. You were imprudent enough to mention that for a while you were on a farm in South Africa. What you did not say, but what I have since found out, is that it was a snake farm. For the first time, Norman Gale showed fear. He tried to speak, but the words would not come. Poirot continued. You were there under your own name, Richards. A photograph of you has been recognized. Again, Norman Gale tried to speak, and failed. His whole personality seemed to change. The handsome, vigorous young man turned into a rat-like creature with furtive eyes, looking for a way of escape, and finding none. It was haste ruined your plan, said Poirot. The superior of the Institut de Marie hurried things on by wiring to Anne Morisot. It would have looked suspicious to ignore that wire. You had impressed upon your wife that unless she suppressed certain facts, either she or you might be suspected of murder. When you met afterwards and learnt that I had been present at the interview, you hurried things along. You were afraid I might get the truth out of Anne. Perhaps she herself was beginning to suspect you. You hustled her out of the hotel and onto the boat train. You administered prussic acid to her by force and left the empty bottle in her hand. "A lot of damn lies," said Norman. "Oh, no, there was a bruise on her neck," said Poirot, "and you even left fingerprints on the bottle. You lie, I wore—" "Ah, you wore gloves. I think, monsieur, that little admission cooks your gander." "You damned interfering at a mountebank!" Livid with passion, Gale made a spring at Poirot. Japp, however, was too quick for him. Holding him in a capable, unemotional grip, he said, "James Richards, alias Norman Gale, I hold a warrant for your arrest on the charge of wilful murder." Norman Gale was taken away. Left alone with Poirot, little Mr. Clancy drew a deep breath of ecstasy. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "that has been absolutely the most thrilling experience of my life. You have been wonderful." Poirot smiled, modestly. "But that poor girl, Jane Grey." It was a month later that Jane came to see Poirot. "I ought to hate you, Monsieur Poirot." She looked pale and fine-drawn, with dark circles round her eyes. Poirot said gently, "Hate me a little, if you will. But I think you are one of those who would rather look truth in the face than live in a fool's paradise. And you might not have lived in it so very long." Jane said, "I shall never fall in love again. What I must do is to have work." Poirot tilted back his chair and looked at the ceiling. "I should advise you to go to Persia with the Dupont." "But I thought that was only a camouflage on your part." Poirot shook his head. "On the contrary, I have become so interested in prehistoric pottery that I have sent the check for the donation I had promised. I heard this morning that they were expecting you to join the expedition. Can you draw at all?" "Yes, I was rather good at drawing at school," replied Jane. "Excellent." "Monsieur Poirot," she looked at him suspiciously, You're not being kind." "I can assure you, mademoiselle, that where money is concerned, I am strictly a man of business." "I'd better go to some museums and look at some prehistoric pottery." "A very good idea." At the doorway she paused, and then came back. "You have been kind to me." She dropped a kiss on the top of his head, and went out again. "Ça, c'est très gentil," said Hercule Poirot. End of Death in the Clouds by Agatha Christie. Read by Bo McKenna.